When a drought-stricken rancher kills a bounty hunter on his land, he discovers two Apache sisters hiding in his barn, fugitives carrying evidence that could topple corrupt officials. But protecting them means confronting the very people who destroyed his family in a story where justice and vengeance collide on the unforgiving Arizona frontier. Welcome to a tale of forbidden alliances and deadly secrets in the Old West. Stay with me until the end to discover how this explosive encounter changes everything, and comment below with your city so I can see how far this story travels across the world. The Arizona sun was a merciless executioner that August morning of 1887, bleeding the life from everything it touched. Elias Carter stood on his porch wooden leg, creaking against the weathered planks, watching buzzards circle overhead like black omens against the copper sky. The drought had lasted 14 months now, turning his once green pastures into a graveyard of cracked earth and bleached bones. He took a long pull from his coffee bitter as the memories that haunted him, and squinted at the horizon where heat waves danced like spirits of the dead. The ranch that had once been his pride, 500 acres of the finest grazing land in Cochise County, now looked like God's own punishment. Cattle carcasses dotted the landscape, mummified by the relentless heat, their ribs jutting skyward like the fingers of buried giants. "Damn this land," he muttered, his voice hoarse from disuse. It had been 3 weeks since he'd spoken to another human being. The hired hands had drifted away months ago when he could no longer pay their wages. Even old Miguel, who'd worked the ranch for 15 years, had finally packed his belongings and headed south to Mexico with tears in his ancient eyes. Elias limped back inside the adobe house, his prosthetic leg a crude affair of oak and leather that he'd carved himself, clicking against the tile floor. The interior was sparse, functional, stripped of the feminine touches that his wife Sarah had once provided. Her portrait still hung above the mantelpiece, but he'd turned it to face the wall years ago. Some wounds never healed, they just learned to hide better. He was reaching for the whiskey bottle when the sound froze him mid-motion. Hoofbeats, coming fast across the hardpan, raising a dust cloud visible through the kitchen window. Elias set down the bottle and reached for the Winchester .44-40 that never left his side, working the lever action with practiced efficiency. In this country, unexpected visitors usually meant trouble, and trouble usually meant death. The rider appeared through the shimmer of heat, a lean man in a dark coat pushing his horse hard despite the killing temperature. Elias watched from behind the window as the stranger reined up near the water trough, dismounting with the quick, efficient movements of someone accustomed to violence. The man wore twin Colts low on his hips, and there was something predatory in the way he surveyed the ranch buildings. Elias stepped onto the porch, rifle held loosely, but ready. "That's far enough, friend. State your business." The stranger turned, and Elias got his first good look at him. Mid-30s, weather-beaten face marked by smallpox scars, eyes the color of winter ice. A lawman's badge caught the sunlight on his vest, but Elias had learned long ago that badges didn't always represent justice. "Name's Pike," the man called out, his voice carrying a slight Texas drawl. "Deputy U.S. Marshal, I'm tracking 2 Apache fugitives. Dangerous ones. Word is they might be heading this way." "Apaches," Elias spat into the dust. "Haven't seen hide nor hair of any Indians for months. They're all penned up on the reservation where they belong." Pike's hand drifted toward his gun butt. These 2 broke out. Sisters, one tall and proud-looking, the other scarred up bad. They killed a white man, Carter, Captain Morrison's boy. The name hit Elias like a physical blow. Captain Morrison, the same blue-coated bastard who'd led the patrol that burned out the Apache camp where his son Tommy had been held captive. The same man who'd told him afterward that Tommy's death was regrettable but necessary for the greater good. The same son of a bitch who'd looked him in the eye and said some sacrifices had to be made for civilization to advance. Morrison, Elias repeated, his knuckles white on the rifle stock. "What's his boy to me? Dead is what he is. These squaws cut him down in cold blood. There's $1,000 bounty on each of their heads, and I aim to collect." Pike stepped closer, his boots crunching on the sun-baked earth. "Now I'm going to search your buildings. You can make this easy or hard, Carter, but it's going to happen either way." Something in the marshal's tone, the casual assumption of authority, the way he looked at Elias like he was nothing more than an obstacle to be moved, triggered memories of other men in uniform who'd spoken the same way, men who'd promised justice and delivered only pain. "I said I haven't seen them," Elias said quietly, "and this is my land. You want to search it, you better have a warrant." Pike's laugh was harsh as a crow's caw. "Warrant out here, you must think you're still back east, cripple. This is Arizona territory and I'm the law. I don't need paper to do my job." The slur hit its mark, but Elias had been called worse by better men. He'd lost the leg to Apache bullets 3 years ago in the same raid that took his son, but he'd learned to balance on one good leg and pure, stubborn hate, and both had served him well. "My property," Elias repeated. "My rules." Pike's patience snapped like an overtaxed rope. His right hand dropped to his Colt in a smooth, practiced draw that spoke of countless gunfights. But Elias Carter had been a soldier before he was a rancher, and 3 years of pain had only sharpened his reflexes. The Winchester spoke first. The .44-40 slug took Pike's center mass, spinning him around and dropping him face first into the dirt beside the water trough. His horse shied away, whinnying in alarm, and a red stain began to spread beneath the dead man's body. Elias worked the lever action again, chambering a fresh round, and limped over to examine the corpse. Pike's eyes stared sightlessly at the sky, already attracting flies. The badge on his vest was genuine enough, but Elias had seen too many crooked lawmen to feel any remorse. A man who drew on a cripple in his own yard got exactly what he deserved. He rolled the body over and began searching the pockets, finding the usual collection of coins, ammunition, and tobacco. But tucked inside Pike's coat was something that made Elias's blood run cold, a hand-drawn map of the surrounding country with his ranch clearly marked. And folded with it, a wanted poster that made his hands shake with rage. 2 faces stared back at him from the yellowed paper, Apache women drawn with surprising detail. The first was indeed tall and regal with high cheekbones and eyes that seemed to look right through the artist. The second bore terrible scars across one side of her face, but there was a fierce intelligence in her gaze that reminded him of a cornered mountain cat. But it wasn't the pictures that froze his blood, it was the crime listed below them. Wanted for the murder of Lieutenant James Morrison, rape and theft of government property. 1,000 reward each, dead or alive. Rape. The word struck him like lightning. These women were wanted for rape. Elias had known plenty of Apache warriors in his time, had fought them and respected them and hated them in equal measure, but Apache women committing rape. It made no sense unless the charges were fabricated, unless someone needed these women silenced so badly they were willing to lie about the nature of their crimes. The sound of creaking wood made him look up sharply. There, framed in the doorway of his barn, stood the 2 fugitives themselves. The taller one stepped forward, moving with the fluid grace of a predator despite her obvious exhaustion. She was exactly as depicted on the wanted poster, tall for an Apache woman with the kind of aristocratic bearing that spoke of high birth among her people. Her long black hair was braided with silver ornaments, and her dress, though travel-stained, was finely made deerskin decorated with intricate beadwork. Her companion remained in the shadows, but Elias could see the scars that marked the left side of her face, pulling her mouth into a permanent half-snarl. She was smaller, more compact, and carried herself like a coiled spring ready to unleash violence. The tall one raised her hands slowly, palms out, in the universal gesture of peace. When she spoke, her English was perfect, with only the slightest accent to mark her heritage. "We do not wish to fight you, soldier," she said, her dark eyes taking in his prosthetic leg and the military bearing he'd never quite lost. We seek only shelter from those who hunt us. You're Apache, Elias said, stating the obvious while his mind raced. He kept the rifle trained on them, but something in the woman's manner stayed his trigger finger. I am Alenya, daughter of White Eagle, granddaughter of Chief Nahil of the Chiricahua people, she replied with quiet dignity. This is my sister, Saraya. We are not what the white man's papers say we are. The scarred one, Saraya, stepped forward slightly, and Elias caught the gleam of a knife in her hand. Her voice, when she spoke, was rougher than her sister's, marked by old pain. The dead man, he came to kill us, she said simply. You have saved us the trouble. Elias looked down at Pike's corpse, then back at the two women. Everything about this situation screamed danger. Harboring Apache fugitives was a hanging offense, and if Morrison was involved, there would be no mercy shown. But the rape charge kept nagging at him, and there was something in Alenya's eyes, a dignity and pain that reminded him of his own wife in her final days. Why would they charge you with rape? He asked bluntly. Alenya's face tightened, and for a moment her composure cracked, revealing a depth of anger that made Elias take an involuntary step back. Because the truth would destroy them, she said quietly. Because what really happened would end careers and topple men who think themselves untouchable. What really happened? It was Saraya who answered, her scarred features twisting with bitter memory. Morrison's son, the lieutenant, he came to our camp under a flag of truce, said he wanted to negotiate for horses, but what he wanted was to force himself on my sister. When she refused, he tried to take what was not offered. Alenya's voice was steady, but Elias could hear the controlled fury beneath the words. I fought him. Saraya came to help me. In the struggle, he struck his head on a rock and died. But by then, his soldiers had heard the commotion. They saw a dead white officer and two Apache women. Saraya continued. Captain Morrison, he made up the story about rape to justify what came next, to justify burning our camp, killing our people, taking the children for the white man's schools. The pieces began falling into place in Elias's mind. He'd heard rumors about the raid on the Apache camp 6 months ago, whispers of excessive force and civilian casualties. If Morrison had lost his son in an attempted rape and then covered it up with a massacre, there's more, Alenya said, reading something in his expression. Papers we took from the lieutenant's saddlebags before we fled. Orders and supply lists and correspondence between Morrison and men in Washington. Proof of corruption that reaches to the highest levels. What kind of proof? Government supplies meant for Apache families, blankets, food, medicine being sold to private ranchers and mine owners, payments to Morrison and his officers for looking the other way while Apache children disappear into Mexican slave markets, evidence that Senator Holloway himself has been profiting from our people's suffering. Senator Holloway. Elias knew the name, a powerful politician who'd made his reputation as an Indian fighter and advocate for civilizing the territories. If such a man was involved in corruption, why should I believe you? He asked, though part of him already did. Alenya reached slowly into her dress and withdrew a leather pouch. From it, she pulled a folded paper covered with official seals and signatures. Because we have proof, because we have names and dates and amounts, because we have the truth and powerful men will kill to keep it buried. Elias took the paper with shaking hands. Even a quick glance confirmed his worst fears. It was a requisition order for Apache rations signed by Morrison, but noting delivery to private buyers instead of the reservation. The profit margins noted in the margins were staggering. Jesus Christ, he whispered. Now you begin to understand, Alenya said softly. We are not murderers or rapists. We are witnesses, and Morrison will not rest until we are silenced forever. The sound of approaching hoofbeats made all three of them freeze. Multiple riders this time coming hard from the south. Elias could see the dust cloud through the barn doorway, growing larger by the second.
Cavalry!
Saraya hissed, recognizing the sound of military horses before the others. Elias's mind raced. Pike's horse was still here, and the marshal's body lay in plain sight. When Morrison's men arrived, they'd know exactly what had happened. And if they found the Apache women here— "The cellar," he said quickly. "Under the kitchen floor, there's a hidden entrance behind the pantry shelves." Alenia studied his face intently. "Why would you help us? We are Apache. Your enemies." The question hit deeper than she could have known. These people had taken everything from him, his son, his leg, his dreams of a peaceful life. By all rights, he should hand them over to Morrison and collect the bounty. But looking at the corruption evidence in his hands, thinking of children sold into slavery and food stolen from starving families, Elias felt something stir in his chest that he hadn't experienced in years. Purpose. "Because some things are more important than old grudges," he said gruffly. "Move, now." The three of them hurried toward the house, Saraya gathering up Pike's scattered belongings, while Alenia clutched the leather pouch. Elias dragged the marshal's body behind the water trough out of immediate sight, then led the women through his kitchen to the hidden cellar entrance. The space beneath the floor was cramped and dark, originally built as a root cellar but expanded during Apache raids as a hiding place. It was barely large enough for two people with only a few inches of clearance above their heads. "Stay quiet no matter what you hear," Elias warned as he lowered the trapdoor. "These men won't hesitate to kill anyone they think is helping you." The hoofbeats were close now, accompanied by the jingle of cavalry sabers and the distinctive creak of military leather. Elias quickly rearranged the pantry shelves to hide the entrance, then limped back to the porch to await his visitors. Captain Morrison himself led the patrol, a compact, hard-faced man with graying hair and the kind of pale eyes that never seemed to blink. He wore his uniform like armor, every button and crease perfect, despite the long ride. Behind him rode a dozen troopers, their faces grim beneath campaign hats, dark with sweat. "Carter," Morrison said, without preamble, dismounting with practiced efficiency. "We're tracking two Apache fugitives, dangerous killers. My scout says their trail leads this way." Elias forced himself to remain calm, leaning against the porch rail as if this were nothing more than a social call. "Afternoon, Captain. Can't say I've seen any Apaches lately. Been pretty quiet out here." Morrison's pale eyes took in every detail of the ranch yard. The scattered cattle bones, the empty corral, the absence of hired hands. Quiet enough to hide fugitives, I'd imagine. A man gets desperate when his ranch is failing, might do things he wouldn't normally consider. Such as harboring enemies of the United States for money, such as interfering with a military operation, such as lying to a federal officer. Morrison stepped closer, his hand resting on his saber hilt. "I know these women came this way, Carter. Their trail is clear as daylight to anyone who knows how to read sign." One of the troopers, a young corporal with nervous eyes, cleared his throat. "Captain, sir, there's a horse over by the water trough, saddled but no rider." Morrison's head snapped around, and Elias felt his heart sink. Pike's mount had wandered back into view, still wearing the marshal's gear. "Well, well," Morrison said softly. "That's Deputy Marshal Pike's horse. Where might Pike himself be, do you suppose?" Before Elias could answer, the same trooper called out again. "Found him, sir, behind the trough. He's dead." The captain's face didn't change expression, but something cold and deadly crept into his pale eyes. "Shot through the chest, I'd wager. Recently, too, given the heat." He turned back to Elias with the slow deliberation of a snake preparing to strike. "Care to explain how a federal marshal ended up dead on your property, Carter?" Elias kept his voice steady, though sweat beaded on his forehead. "Pike came here looking for your Apaches. Started throwing his weight around, threatened to search my buildings without a warrant. When I refused, he went for his gun." "So you killed him?" "Self-defense. He drew first." Morrison smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "How convenient." A crippled rancher outdrawing a professional lawman. I'm sure that's exactly how it happened." The captain gestured to his men, and half the patrol began spreading out to search the buildings. The rest kept their carbines trained on Elias' fingers, resting lightly on triggers. "Sergeant Hayes," Morrison called to a grizzled non-com with sergeant stripes. "Take 3 men and search the house. Corporal Martinez, check the barn and outbuildings. If those Apache bitches are here, I want them found." Elias watched helplessly as the soldiers began their search. The house was small enough that they'd be finished in minutes, and if they found the hidden cellar. "You know," Morrison said conversationally, "I've been looking forward to meeting you, Carter. I remember you from the old days before your unfortunate encounter with Apache hospitality. You were quite the soldier once before you went soft." "Soft?" Elias kept his voice level, but rage was building in his chest like steam in a boiler. "Soft," Morrison repeated. "Living out here alone, making peace with the same savages who crippled you and killed your boy. A real man would have kept fighting, would have made them pay for what they took from him." The captain's words were carefully chosen poison, designed to provoke a reaction, but Elias had learned patience in his years of pain, and he'd need every ounce of it now. "Some of us know when a war is over," he said quietly. "Oh, but this war isn't over, Carter. Not by a long shot. There are still Apache out there who think they can defy the United States government. Still savages who need to learn their place in the new order. Those 2 women I'm hunting, they're symbols of that defiance, and symbols have a way of inspiring others to rebellion." Sergeant Hayes emerged from the house shaking his head. "Nothing, sir. Place is clean." Morrison's jaw tightened, but he nodded curtly. "Keep looking. Check the root cellar, the storm shelter, anywhere 2 people might hide." "Already did, sir. No root cellar that I could find." Elias felt a moment of relief, but it was short-lived. Morrison was studying the house with the eyes of a man who'd spent years hunting human prey, looking for anything that seemed out of place. "Funny thing about Apache," the captain said slowly. "They're clever. Good at hiding, good at making people think they've moved on, when really they're right under your nose. They also have a talent for convincing white men to help them, especially white men who have reason to hate the army." "I've got no love for the army," Elias admitted, "but that doesn't mean I'm harboring fugitives." "Doesn't it?" Morrison walked closer, his pale eyes never leaving Elias's face. "See, the thing is, I know these particular Apache better than most. The tall one, Alenia, she's not just any squaw. She's the granddaughter of Chief Nahil himself, one of the last of the old war leaders. That makes her Apache royalty, which means other tribes will rally to her if she stays free." The captain paused, letting that sink in. "The scarred one, Soraya, she's even more dangerous. Best tracker and hunter among the Chiricahua, they say. Taught by her grandfather himself before we captured the old devil. Together, these 2 represent everything the government has been trying to stamp out: Apache pride, Apache independence, Apache resistance to civilization." Morrison was standing close enough now that Elias could smell the tobacco on his breath, could see the network of broken blood vessels that spoke of too much whiskey and too little sleep. "But here's what really interests me, Carter. These women didn't just kill my son, they stole something from him. Papers that could cause considerable embarrassment to certain people in Washington. Papers that might make some folks think the Apache haven't been treated fairly over the years." The admission hit Elias like a physical blow. Morrison wasn't even trying to hide the corruption anymore, wasn't bothering to pretend this was about justice. This was about covering up crimes, about protecting powerful men who'd grown rich on Apache suffering. "So, you see," Morrison continued, "finding these women isn't just about avenging my boy. It's about protecting the greater good, about making sure misguided sentiments don't interfere with the progress of civilization. Sometimes the truth is too dangerous to be allowed to survive." The corporal came jogging back from the barn, his young face flushed with excitement. "Captain, I found tracks in the barn, recent ones. 2 sets, both barefoot, both the right size for Apache women. Morrison's smile was triumphant. Well, well, it seems we're getting warmer. He turned back to Elias, his hand now resting openly on his pistol butt. Last chance, Carter, tell me where they are, and maybe we can work something out. Keep lying to me and I'll have you shot for killing a federal marshal. Elias looked around at the ring of soldiers, all with weapons ready, all waiting for the word to open fire. He thought of the 2 women huddled in his cellar, of the evidence they carried of the children being sold into slavery, while men like Morrison grew fat on stolen rations. Go to hell, he said quietly. Morrison's face went rigid with fury. Sergeant Hayes, tear this place apart. I want every board pulled up, every stone turned over. Those Apache bitches are here somewhere, and by God, we're going to find them. The search began in earnest now, with soldiers using rifle butts to probe walls and bayonets to test floorboards. They dumped grain sacks and overturned furniture, looking for any sign of hidden spaces. In the kitchen, Hayes began systematically examining the floor, tapping each board to listen for hollow sounds. Elias watched in growing desperation as the sergeant moved closer and closer to the pantry area. The man was thorough professional, taking his time to do the job right. It was only a matter of minutes before he discovered the loose boards that concealed the cellar entrance. That's when the shooting started. The first shot came from the direction of the barn, a sharp crack that echoed off the adobe walls. One of the troopers cried out and spun around, clutching his shoulder where blood was already seeping through his blue uniform. "Sniper!" someone shouted, and the soldiers scattered for cover, their neat search formation dissolving into chaos. More shots followed, coming from different directions, now the barn, the corral, the equipment shed. Whoever was firing knew what they were doing, picking their targets with precision and moving between positions like ghosts. Morrison drew his service revolver and grabbed Elias by the shirt front. "Who else is here, Carter? Who's helping you?" Before Elias could answer, a new voice cut through the gunfire, speaking in rapid Apache from somewhere near the barn. Morrison's face went white as he translated the words. "Running Wolf," he whispered. "That bastard Apache scout. He's supposed to be tracking for us, not—" A bullet whined past Morrison's head, close enough to part his hair, and the captain dove for cover behind the water trough. In the confusion, Elias limped toward the house, hoping to reach the women before the soldiers regained their composure. He made it 3 steps before Sergeant Hayes tackled him, driving him face first into the hard-packed earth. The impact drove the air from his lungs and sent stars dancing across his vision. "I've got Carter," Hayes shouted over the continuing gunfire. "He's not going anywhere." The battle raged for another 10 minutes with unseen enemies, keeping the cavalry pinned down behind whatever cover they could find. But there were too many soldiers and too few attackers. Gradually, the military training began to tell, and the troopers organized themselves into a coherent response. "Flanking movement," Morrison barked from behind the trough. "Martinez, take 4 men and circle around the barn. Peterson, you and Williams lay down covering fire. We need to pin down these shooters and finish this." As the soldiers began to move with renewed purpose, the enemy fire slackened and then stopped altogether. Elias, still pinned under Hayes's weight, heard what sounded like horses moving away at high speed, heading north toward the mountains. Morrison rose cautiously from cover, his uniform torn and his face streaked with dirt. "Casualties." "2 wounded, sir," came the reply. "Nothing serious. Looks like they were trying to wound, not kill." "Apaches showing mercy," Morrison spat. "That's running wolf for you. Too much time around white men has made him soft. But it doesn't matter. They bought Carter time, but they can't hide forever." The captain strode over to where Hayes still held Elias, pinned, his pale eyes burning with frustrated rage. "You knew they were coming. You signaled them somehow." Elias said nothing, though his mind was racing. The attack had indeed been a diversion, but not one he'd arranged. Someone else was playing this game, someone who wanted the Apache women kept alive, but who— "Search the house again," Morrison ordered. And this time, tear up every floorboard if you have to. I want those women found." It took Hayes less than 5 minutes to locate the hidden cellar. The sergeant's trained eye spotted the slightly newer wood around the concealed entrance, and a few hard blows with a rifle butt revealed the hiding place. But when they pulled up the boards and peered into the dark space below, it was empty. Morrison stared into the vacant cellar for a long moment, his face cycling through disbelief, rage, and finally a cold calculation that was somehow more frightening than his anger. "They're gone," he said quietly. "Moved during the attack while we were pinned down." He turned to Elias with murder in his pale eyes. "But you helped them escape. That makes you an accomplice to murder Carter, and accomplices hang just as high as the principals." 2 troopers hauled Elias to his feet, and he found himself staring down the barrel of Morrison's service revolver. The captain's finger was white on the trigger, and for a moment Elias thought his life was over. Then Morrison slowly lowered the weapon, a cruel smile playing around his lips. "No," he said softly. "Shooting you would be too easy, too quick. I want you to suffer first, Carter. I want you to watch as I hunt down your Apache friends and make them pay for what they've cost me. I want you to know that every drop of blood spilled from here on out is on your hands." The captain holstered his pistol and turned to his men. "Sergeant Hayes, leave 2 men to guard the prisoner. The rest of you mount up. We're going after them." "Which direction, sir?" Hayes asked. Morrison studied the ground around the ranch buildings, reading the story told in footprints and hoof marks. "North toward Thunder Canyon. Running Wolf knows that country better than anyone, and he'll try to lose us in the Badlands. But I know something he doesn't. There's only one way through those canyons if you're traveling with wounded or women, and I'll be waiting when they try to use it." As the patrol prepared to ride out, Morrison walked back to where Elias sat under guard. "You made a choice today, Carter. You chose to side with the enemies of civilization, with the very savages who destroyed your family. I hope it was worth it because it's going to cost you everything you have left." The captain swung into his saddle with practiced ease. "When I bring back their scalps, I'll make sure you get a good look at them before I hang you. I want you to see exactly what your mercy bought." With that, Morrison spurred his horse and led his remaining men north at a gallop, leaving only Elias and his 2 guards in the sudden silence of the ranch yard. The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky the color of blood, and somewhere in the distance coyotes began their evening song. Elias closed his eyes and tried not to think about what Morrison would do if he caught the 2 Apache women. But one thought kept echoing in his mind, something Alenia had said about the papers they carried, evidence that could topple senators and end careers. If those documents were real, if they contained proof of the corruption she'd described, then maybe the suffering wouldn't be for nothing. Maybe for once in his life, Elias Carter had chosen the right side in an impossible war. But as the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, he couldn't shake the feeling that he'd signed death warrants for 2 women whose only crime was seeking justice for their people. And that was a burden he wasn't sure even his hate-hardened soul could bear. The night stretched ahead like an eternity filled with unknown dangers and the promise of blood yet to be spilled. In the distance, thunder rumbled along the mountains, though no clouds marred the crystal-clear sky. It was the sound of hoofbeats. Elias realized the sound of pursuer and pursued, racing toward a confrontation that would determine the fate of everyone involved. And there was nothing he could do but wait and pray that some form of justice might yet emerge from the darkness that was coming. The guards Morrison had left behind were young troopers barely out of their teens, and the desert night made them nervous. Private Johnson kept glancing toward the mountains where his captain had disappeared, while Private Walsh continuously checked and rechecked his carbine. They'd positioned themselves on either side of Elias, close enough to watch him, but far enough apart to avoid being taken by surprise. "You think the captain will catch them Apache women?" Johnson asked, his voice betraying the uncertainty that came with his first real campaign. course he will," Walsh replied, though he didn't sound entirely convinced. "Captain Morrison's been hunting Indians since before we was born. Ain't no squaw gonna outsmart him." Elias said nothing, but he was listening to more than just their conversation. The desert had its own language for those who knew how to hear it, and tonight it was speaking of movement in the darkness. Small sounds that didn't belong, the scrape of a boot on stone, the soft whisper of brush being parted by someone trying to move silently. Running Wolf was out there. The Apache scout who'd saved the women during Morrison's search was still close, and Elias had a growing suspicion that the night wasn't over yet. The realization came just as a shadow detached itself from the barn wall. Running Wolf moved like smoke given form, crossing 20 yards of open ground without making a sound. By the time Private Johnson noticed him, the scout was already close enough to strike. The young soldier opened his mouth to shout a warning, but Running Wolf's knife found his throat before any sound could emerge. Johnson collapsed silently, his life bleeding out into the thirsty earth, while Walsh remained obliviously focused on the distant mountains. Running Wolf wiped his blade clean and moved toward the second guard with the same deadly patience. But this time, a loose stone shifted under his moccasin, and Walsh spun around just in time to see death approaching. "Indians!" the private screamed, bringing his carbine up with desperate speed. The shot echoed across the desert like thunder, but Running Wolf was no longer where the barrel was pointed. He'd rolled sideways at the first sign of discovery, coming up behind a water barrel as Walsh's bullet whined harmlessly into the darkness. The private was working the bolt of his single-shot carbine when Running Wolf vaulted over the barrel and tackled him. They went down together in a tangle of limbs, Walsh's greater size and weight against the Apache's speed and experience. For a moment it seemed the young soldier might prevail through sheer desperation. Then Running Wolf's knife found its mark, and Walsh's struggles ceased forever. The scout rose from the corpse and moved quickly to where Elias sat bound. His knife made short work of the ropes, and Elias flexed his hands gratefully as circulation returned to his fingers. "Why?" Elias asked quietly. "Why help me?" Running Wolf was perhaps 40 years old, with graying hair braided with eagle feathers and a face marked by old battle scars. His English was accented but clear, learned during years of service with the army that he now seemed to have abandoned. "Because the women spoke truth about Morrison," he said simply. "Because I have seen the stolen supplies, the children who disappear, the lies written in official reports. Because some things matter more than the money they pay scouts." Elias struggled to his feet, his wooden legs stiff from hours of sitting. Where are they now, Alenia and her sister? Safe for the moment, hidden in caves that Morrison does not know, though he thinks he knows all the secret places. Running Wolf gathered weapons from the dead soldiers, moving with efficient haste. But safety will not last long. He has sent word to Fort Bowie, called for more men. By tomorrow, this entire territory will be crawling with cavalry. And then we need to get them away from here, help them reach Mexico, or... No, Running Wolf's voice was firm. Running will not solve this. Morrison will never stop hunting them, and the corruption will continue. The only way to end this is to make the truth known to those who have power to act. Elias thought of the papers Alenia had shown him, the evidence of stolen supplies and murdered children. "You mean take the documents to the territorial governor to Washington?" "Perhaps. But first we must reach the women alive. Morrison knows where they are going, knows the paths through Thunder Canyon better than I thought possible. He has set a trap, and we must spring it before they walk into it." The two men moved quickly through the ranch buildings, gathering supplies and weapons. Elias strapped on Pike's gun belt, the twin Colts feeling heavy but reassuring on his hips. Running Wolf loaded a pack with ammunition and what food they could carry, his movements quick and efficient. "How long do we have?" Elias asked as they prepared to leave. "Morrison will reach the canyon mouth before dawn. If the women are moving carefully, avoiding the main trails, they might not arrive until midday. That gives us perhaps 6 hours to warn them, or find another way through the mountains. They led 2 of the cavalry horses from the corral animals trained for long rides and rough country. Elias's wooden leg made mounting awkward, but years of practice had taught him to compensate for the disability. Within minutes, they were riding north under a sky brilliant with desert stars. The first hour passed in relative silence. Both men focused on covering ground quickly while avoiding the obvious trails Morrison might have watched. Running Wolf led them through arroyos and over ridges that seemed impassable in the darkness, following paths known only to those who had grown up in this harsh country. "Tell me about the women," Elias said during a brief rest to water the horses. Alenia spoke of being Chief Nahil's granddaughter. That name carries weight even among white settlers. Running Wolf's face darkened. "Nahil was my grandfather also, though by marriage not blood. He was the last of the great war chiefs, the last man who remembered when the Apache were free to ride where they chose. The army captured him 3 summers ago, and he has been dying slowly in their prison ever since." Prison, Fort Bowie. They keep him in a cell, tell visitors he is being rehabilitated for eventual release to the reservation. But I have seen him, and I know he will never leave that place alive. Morrison makes sure of that. Elias absorbed this information, understanding now why Morrison was so determined to capture Nahil's granddaughter. With the old chief dying in captivity, Alenia represented the last link to Apache independence, the final symbol of resistance to American authority. What about the sister Soraya, Nahil's other granddaughter, though her scars tell a different story? She was captured as a child during one of the early raids taken by Mexican slavers who sold her to a mine owner near Tucson. The scars came from fighting her captors trying to escape. When she finally succeeded years later, she was no longer the same person. Running Wolf paused, his eyes distant with memory. Soraya learned to hate during those years of slavery, learned to kill efficiently and without mercy. Some among our people fear her as much as they respect her, but her loyalty to Alenia has never wavered. They rode on through the night, crossing terrain that would have been difficult in daylight and was nearly impossible in darkness. But Running Wolf seemed to have an instinctive knowledge of every stone and gully, guiding them steadily northward toward the looming bulk of Thunder Canyon. As the eastern sky began to show the first faint traces of dawn, they reached a high ridge that overlooked the canyon's southern approach. Running Wolf dismounted and led Elias to a vantage point among the rocks, where they could observe the terrain below without being seen. The view was breathtaking and terrifying in equal measure. Thunder Canyon cut through the mountains like a giant's axe wound its walls, rising nearly vertical for hundreds of feet. The floor of the canyon was narrow, barely wide enough for a wagon in most places, with the small stream that had carved it meandering between house-sized boulders. There, Running Wolf pointed to a cluster of cavalry horses nearly invisible among the rocks at the canyon's mouth. Morrison arrived 2 hours ago. He has positioned his men to cover all the obvious approaches. Elias studied the deployment through Pike's field glasses, counting at least a dozen soldiers hidden among the boulders and scrub brush. Morrison had chosen his ambush site well. The women would have to cross nearly 100 yards of open ground to reach the canyon entrance, and there was no cover large enough to hide behind. "Can we circle around, find another route?" "There is no other route for horses," Running Wolf said grimly. "The canyon walls are too steep, the side passages too narrow. Morrison knows this. It is why he chose this place for his trap." As they watched, 2 figures appeared on a distant ridge, barely visible in the growing light. Even at this distance, Elias could make out the distinctive silhouettes of the Apache women moving carefully from cover to cover as they approached the canyon. "They don't see the ambush," he muttered. "They're going to walk right into it." Running Wolf was studying the canyon walls with intense concentration. "There might be another way, a path my grandfather showed me when I was a boy before the white soldiers came. It is dangerous, especially for horses, but it leads to a ledge overlooking the ambush site." "How dangerous?" "One mistake means a fall of 200 feet onto solid rock. and even if we reached the ledge safely, we would be outnumbered 3-1. Elias thought of Morrison's pale eyes, of the captain's promise to make the women suffer before he killed them. He thought of the evidence they carried, proof of corruption that reached to the highest levels of government. Most of all, he thought of his son Tommy and all the other children who had died because good men chose to do nothing when evil showed its face. Show me this path. The route Running Wolf remembered was less a path than a controlled fall down the canyon's eastern wall. They left the horses tied among the rocks and began their descent on foot, Elias's wooden leg, making every step a challenge. Loose stone shifted treacherously underfoot, and more than once he found himself clinging to handholds no larger than his fingertips. "When I was young," Running Wolf said softly as they paused on a narrow ledge, "my grandfather brought me here to teach me about courage. He said that sometimes a man must choose between safety and honor, and that the choice reveals who he truly is. What did you choose? I became a scout for the army that imprisoned him. I told myself it was practical, that I could do more good from within their ranks than as a hunted fugitive. But the truth is, I chose safety over honor, and it has eaten at my soul like poison ever since." They continued their dangerous descent, moving one careful step at a time while the sun climbed higher in the eastern sky. Below them, Morrison's soldiers waited in their concealed positions, unaware that a death was approaching from above. The ledge Running Wolf had mentioned proved to be a narrow shelf of rock about halfway down the canyon wall, barely wide enough for 2 men to stand side by side. But it offered a commanding view of the ambush site, and more importantly, it was directly above where Morrison had positioned himself. "There," Running Wolf pointed to a cluster of boulders where the captain waited with 3 of his best marksmen. "Morrison believes he is safe there, protected by his men and the canyon walls. He does not expect an attack from above." Elias checked his weapons one final time, Pike's twin Colts and a Winchester rifle taken from one of the dead guards. The range was perhaps 50 yards, well within the capabilities of his marksmanship, but shooting downward at this angle would be tricky. "When the women appear, Morrison will want to take them alive," Running Wolf continued. "He needs to recover the documents before he can afford to kill them. That will give us a few moments to act. What about the other soldiers? Leave them to me. I know each man by name, know which ones have families and which ones are simply following orders. I will give them a chance to surrender before I kill them." They settled in to wait, watching as the 2 Apache women moved steadily closer to the canyon entrance. Alenia led the way, her aristocratic bearing unmistakable even at this distance, while Soraya followed like a shadow, her scarred face constantly scanning for danger. Morrison seemed to sense their approach before they came into view. The captain emerged from cover just enough to signal his men, positioning them for the capture he had planned. His pale eyes glittered with anticipation as he checked his service revolver. "Get ready," Running Wolf whispered. "They will be within rifle range in moments." The women appeared at the canyon mouth like ghosts, materializing from the desert heat. Alenia paused at the edge of the open ground, her instincts clearly warning her of danger, but she had no way of knowing exactly where the threat lay hidden. Morrison let them come 20 yards into the open before he sprang his trap. "That's far enough, ladies," the captain called out, rising from concealment with his revolver drawn. "United States Army, you're surrounded." Soldiers appeared from behind rocks and brush. Their carbines trained on the 2 women. Alenia and Soraya stopped immediately, but neither showed any sign of panic or surprise. If anything, they seemed to have expected this moment. "Captain Morrison," Alenia said, her voice carrying clearly in the still air, "I wondered when you would work up the courage to face us yourself, instead of sending others to die." Morrison's face flushed with anger at the insult. "Brave words from a murderer, but your killing days are over, squaw. Drop your weapons and surrender, and I might let you live long enough to stand trial." "Trial?" Soraya laughed, the sound harsh and bitter. The same kind of trial you gave the children at Copper Creek. The same justice you showed the families at White River. Those savages got exactly what they deserved, just as you're going to get what you deserve." Elias could see Morrison's control beginning to slip, the captain's carefully maintained facade cracking under the weight of his rage and guilt. This was the moment to strike while the officer was focused entirely on his prey. He took careful aim with the Winchester, lining up the shot that would end Morrison's reign of terror forever. His finger was tightening on the trigger when Alenya's voice rang out across the canyon. "Before you kill us, Captain, perhaps you should know that we are not the only ones who possess evidence of your crimes." Morrison's head snapped up, his pale eyes suddenly alert. "What evidence? What are you talking about?" "The supply records, the correspondence with Senator Holloway, the bills of sale for Apache children sold to Mexican slavers. Did you really think we would carry the only copies with us when we fled?" The captain's face went white as the implication sank in. "You're lying." "Am I?" "Ask yourself this, Morrison. Why did your own scout turn against you? Why did Running Wolf choose to help us instead of collecting the bounty on our heads?" Morrison spun around, suddenly aware that his Apache tracker was nowhere to be seen. "Where is Running Wolf, Sergeant Hayes?" But Hayes was 20 yards away, focused on keeping the women covered, and couldn't hear the captain's increasingly frantic calls. That's when Elias squeezed the trigger. The Winchester's boom echoed off the canyon walls like thunder, and Morrison spun around as the bullet took him high in the shoulder. The captain stumbled but didn't fall, his military training keeping him upright even as blood began to soak his uniform. "Sniper!" someone shouted, and the carefully orchestrated ambush dissolved into chaos as soldiers scattered for better cover. Running Wolf's voice echoed from another part of the canyon wall, speaking in rapid Apache. Alenya and Soraya immediately dove for the nearest boulder, disappearing from sight as carbine bullets began to chip stone around them. Elias worked the Winchester's lever and fired again, this time at a soldier who was trying to flank the women's position. The man cried out and fell, clutching his leg as his companions realized they were under attack from multiple directions. "Form square," Morrison bellowed, trying to regain control of his scattered men, covering fire on the canyon walls. But the soldiers were green troops, unused to fighting an enemy they couldn't see. Their shots went wild, ricocheting off stone and sending echoes bouncing through the canyon like the voices of angry gods. Running Wolf appeared briefly on a ledge across from Elias, his rifle speaking with deadly precision. Another soldier fell, then another, as the Apache scout demonstrated why he had once been considered the Army's best tracker. "Fall back," Morrison ordered, his voice hoarse with pain and fury. "Tactical withdrawal to the mouth of the canyon." The surviving soldiers began a fighting retreat, using covering fire to bound from rock to rock, while their captain tried to maintain some semblance of order. But Morrison himself was trapped in the open, pinned down by accurate fire from above. Elias could see the women moving among the boulders below, working their way toward the canyon entrance while the soldiers were distracted. Soraya's rifle added its voice to the battle, her shots carefully placed to force the cavalry back without necessarily killing them. "Carter!" Morrison's voice was raw with rage as he spotted Elias on the ledge above. "I should have known you'd be here, should have shot you when I had the chance." The captain raised his service revolver and fired, but shooting upward at a steep angle threw off his aim. The bullet sparked off stone inches from Elias's head, and the return shot from the Winchester took Morrison's hat clean off. For a moment, the two men stared at each other across 50 yards of empty air, the crippled rancher who had lost everything to Apache raids, and the Army captain who had built his career on their suffering. Between them lay years of pain and hatred, of choices made and prices paid. Then Morrison broke and ran for the canyon mouth, his wounded shoulder hampering his movements, but his survival instincts driving him forward. Elias had a clear shot at the fleeing officer's back, but something stayed his trigger finger. Perhaps it was mercy. Or perhaps he simply wanted Morrison to live long enough to face justice for his crimes. The battle was effectively over. The surviving soldiers had reached the horses and were preparing to ride hard for Fort Bowie, carrying news of the disaster that would bring overwhelming reinforcements within hours. But for the moment, the canyon belonged to the Apache and their unlikely ally. Elias made his way carefully down from the ledge, his wooden leg making the descent even more treacherous than the climb up had been. By the time he reached the canyon floor, Running Wolf had already joined the two women among the boulders. "Are you hurt?" Alenia asked, noting the cuts and scrapes Elias had acquired during his climb. "Nothing serious, but Morrison got away and he'll be back with every soldier at Fort Bowie." "Let him come," Soraya said, grimly checking her rifle for damage. "We have what we came for, and now the whole territory will know that Morrison can be beaten." Running Wolf was studying the canyon walls with the eye of someone planning their next move. "We cannot stay here. This place will be swarming with cavalry by nightfall, and they will bring artillery to blast us out of any hiding place." "Then where?" Elias asked. "You said yourself there's no other way through the mountains." "There is one possibility," Alenia said slowly. "Something my grandfather told me before they took him to Fort Bowie. A hidden pass known only to our family, used by war parties in the old days, when they needed to move unseen." Running Wolf's eyes widened. "The ghost trail, but that is only legend stories told around council fires." "All legends have some basis in truth," Alenia replied. "And if it exists, it would take us directly to Fort Bowie itself. Perhaps it is time the great Chief Nahil was reunited with his granddaughters." The implications of her words hit Elias like a physical blow. She was talking about rescuing her grandfather from a military prison, attempting something that would bring the full weight of the United States Army down on their heads. "That's suicide," he said flatly. "Fort Bowie is the most heavily defended post in Arizona territory. You'd never get within a mile of the prison compound." "Perhaps," Alenia agreed. "But consider this: Morrison is wounded and demoralized, his credibility damaged by today's defeat. Senator Holloway and his allies will be questioning whether their investment in the captain is still worthwhile. This might be our only chance to strike before they bring in someone more competent to finish what Morrison started." Soraya was nodding slowly, her scarred face animated by the possibility of action. "And if we can free grandfather, his voice would carry weight with the territorial governor, with newspapers back east. People who would never listen to two Apache women might pay attention to the last of the great war chiefs." Running Wolf looked troubled by the direction the conversation was taking. "Even if the ghost trail exists, even if we could reach Fort Bowie undetected, how would we get inside? The prison compound is separate from the main fort, surrounded by its own walls and guard towers." "I have been thinking about that since they took him," Alenia said quietly. "Fort Bowie gets its supplies from civilian contractors, men who come and go without much scrutiny. If we could replace one of those supply wagons—" "A Trojan horse," Elias murmured, remembering his classical education from before the war, hidden inside the very supplies meant to keep the fort running. The plan was audacious to the point of madness, but as Elias thought about it, he began to see how it might work. Morrison's failure in the canyon would create confusion and recriminations at the fort. Officers would be focused on preparing for a massive manhunt, not on inspecting routine supply deliveries. "There is one more thing to consider," Alenia said, her dark eyes meeting Elias's. "This is not your fight, soldier. You have already done more than anyone could expect, and you owe my people nothing after what they took from you." The words hung in the desert air between them, laden with the weight of shared pain and mutual respect. Elias thought of his son Tommy, of the wife who had died grieving for their lost child, of the years of bitterness and isolation that had followed. "My son died because good men stood by and did nothing while evil flourished," he said finally. "Maybe it's time I tried to be one of the good men." Running Wolf clasped his shoulder, with surprising gentleness. Then we ride the ghost trail together if it exists. And if it does not, at least we will die trying to do something worthy. The four unlikely allies gathered their weapons and what supplies they could carry, preparing to venture into the unknown passages that might or might not lead to Fort Bowie. Behind them, the canyon was already beginning to show signs of the Army's return, dust clouds on the horizon, marking the approach of reinforcements. As they climbed toward the hidden entrance that Alenia believed would lead to the legendary trail, Elias couldn't help but marvel at the strange turns his life had taken. Less than 24 hours ago, he had been a broken-down rancher, drowning his sorrows in whiskey and self-pity. Now he was part of a desperate mission to rescue an Apache chief from a federal prison, carrying evidence that could topple senators and expose corruption at the highest levels of government. The sun was climbing toward its zenith when they finally located what Alenia had been searching for, a narrow crack in the canyon wall that seemed too small to admit a human being, let alone horses. But as they approached, the crack widened into a passage that had been cunningly concealed by the natural rock formations. The ghost trail. Alenia whispered, her voice filled with wonder and reverence. My grandfather was right. It does exist. Document number Part 3, Canyon of Blood. The passage beyond the concealed entrance was barely wide enough for a horse and rider, carved from living rock by countless generations of Apache hands. Ancient pictographs decorated the walls, warriors on horseback eagles. The passage beyond the concealed entrance was barely wide enough for a horse and rider, carved from living rock by countless generations of Apache hands. Ancient pictographs decorated the walls, warriors on horseback eagles, soaring above mountain peaks, and symbols that spoke of journeys undertaken when the world was younger and the land belonged to those who understood its secrets. My great-grandfather helped carve these tunnels, Alenia said softly, running her fingers over the weathered stone. When the Spanish came with their armor and crosses, when the first American settlers pushed into our territory, this was our highway, our secret road that let us move unseen across the sacred mountains. The horses moved nervously in the confined space, their hooves echoing off stone walls that seemed to press closer with each step. Elias's wooden legs scraped against the rock repeatedly, sending sparks of pain up his damaged thigh, but he gritted his teeth and kept moving. Behind them, they could hear the distant sound of cavalry trumpets as Morrison's reinforcements began their search of Thunder Canyon. How far does this go? Running Wolf asked, his voice barely above a whisper in the oppressive silence. 15 miles, perhaps 20, Alenia replied. The passages twist and branch like the roots of an ancient tree. Some lead to hidden valleys where our people once gathered for ceremonies. Others emerge near sacred springs that have never known the touch of white men's hands. They rode single file through the twisting passages, guided only by Alenia's ancestral memory and the faint current of air that suggested an eventual exit. Hours passed in the strange twilight of the tunnels, marked only by the steady clip-clop of hooves and the occasional scrape of leather against spent stone. It was Soraya who first noticed they were being followed. "Something moves behind us," she whispered, her scarred hand moving instinctively to her knife. Too regular for echoes, too distant for cavalry horses. They stopped in a wider section of the passage, listening intently to the sounds that filtered through the rock. There, the soft pad of unshod feet, moving with the careful patience of a predator stalking its prey. "Apache," Running Wolf said grimly, "but not from our band. The footfalls are wrong, the rhythm different. Mescalero." Alenia breathed, her face tightening with recognition and fear. Morrison must have offered them a bounty to track us through the sacred passages. The Mescalero Apache had been traditional enemies of the Chiricahua for generations, their rivalry dating back to disputes over hunting grounds and water rights that had persisted even after both tribes were confined to reservations. If Morrison had promised them gold and horses in exchange for capturing the fugitives, some of the younger warriors might have been desperate enough to accept. "How many?" Elias asked, checking his weapons in the dim light that filtered down from hidden air shafts. Soraya closed her eyes and listened with the focused intensity of someone whose life had often depended on such skills. 4, perhaps 5. Moving in single file, like us, but faster. They know these tunnels as well as we do. "Then we cannot outrun them," Running Wolf said. "And in these narrow passages, superior numbers mean nothing. It will be blade work, close and bloody." Alenia was studying the tunnel walls with the same concentration her sister had applied to listening. "There is another way, a branch passage that leads to the Chamber of Echoes. If we can reach it before they catch us, we might be able to turn their numbers against them." "What is this chamber?" Elias asked as they spurred their horses forward at a faster pace. "A natural amphitheater where our warriors once tested their courage," she explained, her voice strained with the effort of controlling her nervous horse. "The acoustics are strange sounds, bounce and multiply until a single voice becomes a dozen. If we position ourselves correctly, 5 enemies might think they face 20. The passage began to slope upward, and the air grew fresher as they climbed toward whatever lay ahead. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit grew louder and more distinct. Their hunters had abandoned stealth in favor of speed gambling, that they could overtake their quarry before reaching whatever destination they sought. There, Alenia pointed to a narrow opening that branched off to the right, almost hidden by a fall of broken rock. "The old path to the chamber, but we must leave the horses. The passage is too narrow for mounted travel." They dismounted quickly, transferring weapons and ammunition to their persons, while the sound of approaching footsteps echoed ever closer. The horses, trained for war, seemed to sense the danger and stood quietly as their riders prepared for battle. "I'll take the rear guard," Running Wolf said, drawing a wicked-looking knife that gleamed even in the dim light. "If they try to follow us into the branch passage, they'll have to come past me first." "No," Elias said firmly. "You know the country ahead, know where this Chamber of Echoes is located. I'll hold them here as long as possible, then follow if I can." Before anyone could argue, the first Mescalero warrior appeared around a bend in the tunnel, moving with the fluid grace of a man born to warfare. He saw Elias immediately and froze his dark eyes, taking in the scarred white man with the wooden leg who blocked his path. "Go," Elias said quietly to the others. "Go now." The warrior raised his rifle, an old Spencer repeater that had probably been taken from a dead cavalry trooper, but Elias was already moving. His twin Colts cleared leather with surprising speed for a man hampered by a prosthetic limb, and the thunder of gunfire filled the confined space like the voice of an angry god. The first Mescalero spun and fell, his rifle clattering on stone as Elias's bullets found their mark. But the sound of shooting brought the others running, and suddenly the tunnel was full of dark figures wielding weapons that gleamed in the muzzle flashes. Elias emptied both revolvers into the advancing warriors, working the triggers with mechanical precision while his mind calculated angles and distances. 2 more attackers fell, but the remaining Mescaleros pressed forward with the desperate courage of men who knew retreat meant disgrace. A lance point scraped across his ribs, parting cloth and skin as he twisted away from the thrust. His return stroke with an empty Colt caught the warrior across the temple, dropping him stunned to the tunnel floor. But there were still more coming, and his ammunition was running low. That's when the reinforcements arrived. The distinctive crack of Soraya's rifle echoed from the branch passage, and one of the Mescaleros pitched forward with a bullet between his shoulder blades. Running Wolf appeared like a ghost behind the remaining warriors, his knife finding kidney and spine with surgical precision. In moments, it was over. 5 Mescalero warriors lay dead or dying in the narrow tunnel, their blood darkening the ancient stone that had witnessed countless such battles over the centuries. "Any more behind these?" Running Wolf asked, Wiping his blade clean on a dead warrior's shirt, Elias listened carefully to the sounds that filtered through the tunnels. Nothing. Morrison must have hired only this one band, probably promised them our horses and weapons if they brought back our scalps. "Then we continue," Alenia said, though her voice shook slightly from the proximity of violence. "The chamber lies ahead and beyond that the passage that leads to Fort Bowie." They gathered what useful equipment they could from the fallen warriors, ammunition, water, dried meat that would help sustain them on the journey ahead. The Mescalero weapons were well maintained, speaking of warriors who took pride in their tools, even when selling their services to the highest bidder. The branch passage proved even narrower than the main tunnel, forcing them to move in single file, with barely inches of clearance on either side. But it also climbed more steeply, carrying them higher into the mountain's heart, where air currents spoke of hidden chambers and forgotten places. "Listen," Soraya said suddenly, holding up a hand for silence. They stopped, straining their ears for whatever had caught her attention. At first there was only the expected silence of deep earth. Then gradually they became aware of a new sound, a low, rhythmic booming that seemed to come from the stone itself. "What is that?" Elias asked. "Artillery," Running Wolf said grimly. "Morrison has brought field guns to Thunder Canyon. He's trying to blast his way into the passages we used to escape." The implications were sobering. If the army could breach the sacred tunnels with artillery, the Apache would lose one of their last advantages in the ongoing war. These passages had been their secret highways for generations, allowing small bands to move undetected across vast distances. Their violation by white soldiers would be more than a tactical loss. It would be a desecration of everything the mountain Apaches held sacred. "All the more reason to succeed in our mission," Alenia said with quiet determination. "If we can free my grandfather, if we can expose Morrison's corruption to the world, perhaps some good can come from this violation of sacred ground." The Chamber of Echoes proved to be everything Alenia had promised: a natural cathedral carved from living rock, its walls rising into darkness beyond the reach of their torches. Strange acoustic properties turned their whispered words into seeming multitudes, creating the illusion that dozens of invisible speakers shared the vast space. But it was not empty. Ancient bones littered the chamber floor, the remains of warriors who had come here to prove their courage in ritual combat, or perhaps to die with honor when age or injury made them burdens to their people. Weapons corroded by centuries lay beside the skeletons, testament to battles fought and won in this sacred place. "The testing ground," Alenia whispered, her voice multiplying into a chorus of ghosts, "where young men came to face their fears and emerge as warriors, where the old came to meet death with dignity." They moved carefully through the bone field, showing respect for the ancient dead while searching for the passage that would carry them toward Fort Bowie. It was Running Wolf who found the exit, a narrow crack in the far wall that required them to remove their gun belts and squeeze through sideways. Beyond lay another tunnel, this one showing signs of more recent use. The walls were marked with cavalry boot prints and the distinctive scratches left by military equipment. Someone had been using this passage within the past few years, probably scouts or special detachments, moving on missions too sensitive for official records. "Morrison's secret highway," Running Wolf said with disgust. "He has been using our sacred passages for his own purposes, probably moving stolen supplies or transporting prisoners he doesn't want anyone to know about." The tunnel continued for what felt like hours, gradually descending as it carried them north, toward the military installation that held Chief Nahil prisoner. They passed side chambers filled with military supplies, ammunition crates marked with false destinations, medical supplies supposed to have been delivered to Apache families, even cases of whiskey meant to keep cooperative tribal leaders compliant. "Here is your proof," Alenia said bitterly, examining shipping manifests that had been carelessly left with the stolen goods. Every crate stolen from our people, every medicine bottle that never reached sick children, Morrison has been using these tunnels as his private warehouse. Elias studied the documents by torchlight, his anger growing with each fraudulent invoice and forged signature. The scope of the corruption was staggering, not just individual acts of greed, but a systematic looting of government resources meant to feed and care for displaced Apache families. "This is enough to hang Morrison," he said quietly. "Maybe enough to bring down Senator Holloway and his whole network of thieves. If we can get it to honest authorities," Soraya replied. "If there are any honest authorities left in this territory." They pressed on through the tunnels, following passages that seemed to have been expanded and improved by military engineers. Electric cables ran along the walls in some sections, carrying power to hidden installations that officially didn't exist. The air grew fresher as they climbed, suggesting they were approaching the surface once again. It was near dawn when they finally reached the end of their underground journey. A concealed entrance camouflaged with brush and painted canvas opened onto a hillside overlooking Fort Bowie itself. The massive installation spread across the valley below them, like a small city, its adobe walls and wooden buildings surrounding the central parade ground where the flag of the United States hung limp in the still air. There, Alenia pointed to a separate compound set apart from the main fort, the prison where they hold my grandfather and other Apache leaders who refused to accept reservation life. The prison was a grim structure of stone and iron, surrounded by its own walls and guard towers. Even from their distant vantage point, they could see sentries walking their posts with military precision. Getting inside would require more than just courage. It would take careful planning and no small amount of luck. "The supply wagons arrive every Tuesday and Friday," Running Wolf said, drawing on his knowledge of military routines. "Civilian contractors from Tucson, usually carrying food and medical supplies for the prisoners. If we could intercept one of those wagons, replace the drivers and guards," Elias continued the thought, "use their passes and papers to get inside the compound legitimately." "But where would we find a supply wagon to intercept?" Soraya asked. "And how do we deal with the real drivers without alerting the authorities?" Alenia was studying the fort through Pike's field glasses, her attention focused on something beyond the prison compound. "There," she said quietly. "Do you see that building with the red roof just outside the main gates?" Elias took the glasses and adjusted the focus. The building she indicated was clearly a civilian establishment, probably a trading post or saloon, that catered to off-duty soldiers and visiting contractors. Even as he watched, he could see wagons coming and going, their drivers stopping to refresh themselves before continuing their journeys. "Martinez Trading Post," Running Wolf said with recognition. "The old Mexican who runs it has no love for the army, but he's too afraid to actively oppose them. He might be willing to help if we approach him correctly. And if he refuses, then we take what we need and leave him tied up but unharmed. He can tell the authorities that masked bandits forced him to cooperate." They spent the rest of the day observing the fort's routines, noting guard changes and supply deliveries. The prison compound operated with clockwork precision. Visitors were searched thoroughly, credentials were checked against written lists, and no one entered or left without proper authorization. But the supply deliveries were handled more casually. Civilian drivers who made regular runs were often waved through with minimal inspection, their familiar faces and routine cargo earning them a level of trust that could be exploited. "Tomorrow is Friday," Running Wolf noted as evening shadows began to lengthen across the valley. "There should be at least 2 supply wagons making deliveries to the prison compound. If we can intercept one of them early enough—" "We'll need more than just a wagon," Elias pointed out. "We'll need papers, uniforms, if possible, and some way to explain why we're carrying weapons into a military prison." Alenia had been unusually quiet during their planning session, staring down at the fort with an intensity that suggested she was working through some complex problem. When she finally spoke, her words carried the weight of absolute determination. "I know another way," she said quietly, "more dangerous than your supply wagon plan, but with a better chance of reaching my grandfather." "What way?" "Morrison will be returning to Fort Bowie tonight or tomorrow morning, wounded and humiliated by his failure at Thunder Canyon. He'll need to report to his superiors, explain how 2 Apache women and their allies made fools of an entire cavalry patrol." Soraya's scarred face broke into a cold smile as she grasped her sister's meaning. And a man in Morrison's position might find himself in need of a scapegoat, someone to blame for the disaster. Exactly. If we can arrange for Morrison to apparently capture us, he might be able to salvage some of his reputation. And captured Apache leaders would certainly be taken to see Chief Nahil, if only to gloat over their defeat. The plan was audacious to the point of madness, requiring them to place themselves entirely at Morrison's mercy while gambling that his desperation would overcome his caution. But it also offered advantages that the supply wagon approach lacked legitimate access to the most secure parts of the prison and the element of surprise when they revealed their true intentions. "It could work," Running Wolf said slowly. "Morrison is arrogant enough to believe he could handle 2 Apache women even if he suspected treachery, and his need to appear successful might overcome his better judgment." "What about me?" Elias asked. "Morrison knows I'm working with you. He won't buy any deception that includes my capture." "You'll be our hidden weapon," Alenia replied. "While Morrison is congratulating himself on capturing the granddaughters of Chief Nahil, you'll be infiltrating the compound through whatever means you can manage. When we make our move to free grandfather, you'll provide the distraction we need to escape." As they finalized their desperate plan, the sun set behind the mountains in a blaze of red and gold that reminded Elias of the fires that had consumed his old life. Tomorrow they would gamble everything on a scheme that would either free a legendary Apache chief or get them all killed in the attempt. The night passed slowly as they took turns standing watch and trying to rest. When dawn finally broke over Fort Bowie, it illuminated a world that seemed balanced on the edge of violence, where the slightest miscalculation could trigger consequences that would echo across the territory for years to come. In the distance, a dust cloud marked the approach of Morrison's defeated patrol, returning to explain their failure to superiors who would demand answers and accountability. Soon the final act of their deadly drama would begin, with all their lives hanging in the balance and the fate of an entire people depending on their success or failure. The fortress below them stirred to life as bugle calls echoed across the parade ground, but none of the soldiers going about their morning routines had any idea that 4 desperate fugitives watched from the hills above, preparing to attempt the impossible rescue of the last great Apache war chief. History would remember this day one way or another as the moment when justice finally came to the Arizona territory, or when it died forever in the dungeons of Fort Bowie. Morrison's return to Fort Bowie was everything Alenia had predicted. A humiliated officer riding at the head of a decimated patrol, his wounded shoulder a visible testament to his failure. From their hidden vantage point, the 4 conspirators watched as the captain dismounted stiffly at the fort's main gate, his pale eyes scanning the surrounding hills as if expecting another attack at any moment. "Look at him," Soraya whispered with satisfaction. "He knows his career hangs by a thread now. One more failure, and even Senator Holloway's protection won't save him from a court-martial." The timing of their deception had to be perfect. Too early, and Morrison might be too suspicious to fall for their ruse. Too late, and he might already be facing a board of inquiry that would make capturing fugitives irrelevant to his future. They needed to strike while his desperation was at its peak, but before his superiors had time to fully assess the disaster at Thunder Canyon. "There," Running Wolf pointed to a dust cloud approaching from the south. "Supply wagon right on schedule. If we move now, we can intercept it before it reaches the trading post." Elias shouldered his rifle and checked his ammunition one final time. While the others prepared for their dangerous masquerade as captured prisoners, he would have to find his own way into the fort, a challenge made more difficult by his distinctive appearance and Morrison's personal hatred for him. "Remember," Alenia said as they prepared to separate, "we need at least an hour inside the prison compound before you create your distraction. My grandfather is old and weak. It will take time to get him mobile enough for an escape attempt." "How will I know when you're ready?" 3 shots fired rapidly from inside the compound, Soraya replied. "That will be our signal that we have grandfather and are moving toward the exit." They clasped hands in the Apache fashion, knowing this might be the last time they saw each other alive. Then Elias limped down the hill toward a different destiny, while his 3 companions prepared to place their lives entirely in the hands of their greatest enemy. The supply wagon proved to be driven by an elderly Mexican and his teenage grandson, both of whom surrendered immediately when faced with Running Wolf's rifle and grim expression. They were honest men making an honest living, and harming them was never part of the plan. "We mean you no harm, old father," Running Wolf said in Spanish, his voice gentle despite the weapon in his hands. "But we need your wagon and your papers for a few hours. When this is over, you will be compensated for your trouble." The old man Garcia, according to his shipping documents, studied the 3 fugitives with shrewd eyes that had seen much of life's injustices. "You are the ones Captain Morrison hunts," he said finally. "The Apache women who killed his son." "We defended ourselves against rape," Alenia replied simply. "Nothing more, nothing less." Garcia's weathered face hardened at the word. He had daughters and granddaughters of his own, and understood what that meant. "Take the wagon," he said quietly, "and may God go with you in whatever justice you seek." Within an hour, the deception was in place. Running Wolf drove the supply wagon with practiced skill, his cavalry experience serving him well in handling the team. Alenia and Soraya sat in the back among the medical supplies and food crates, their hands bound with rope that would part at the first hard pull, but looked convincing to casual observation. The story they had rehearsed was simple. Running Wolf had been tracking the fugitive sisters when he came upon them stealing from Garcia's wagon. Rather than risk a firefight that might damage valuable supplies, he had overpowered them through stealth and was bringing them to Fort Bowie for the reward money. It was a thin deception, but it played to Morrison's arrogance and his desperate need for a victory to salvage his reputation. If the captain wanted to believe he had competent subordinates, he might overlook the convenient timing of their success. The guards at the fort's main gate were young soldiers who recognized Running Wolf from his previous service as a scout. They waved the wagon through with minimal inspection, more interested in the bound prisoners than in examining the cargo manifest too closely. "Morrison's going to want to see these 2 right away," one of them called out. "He's been raging about them for days, promising all kinds of rewards for whoever brings them in." Running Wolf nodded and drove toward the command building where Morrison's office overlooked the parade ground. Through the windows they could see the captain pacing back and forth like a caged animal, his wounded arm in a sling, but his remaining hand gesturing violently as he spoke to someone out of sight. "Colonel Brennan," Alenia murmured, recognizing the fort's commanding officer through the glass. "Morrison is already explaining his failure to his superior. This could work perfectly if Brennan is present when Morrison claims credit for our capture. He'll be a witness to whatever story the captain tells." The office door opened as Running Wolf brought the wagon to a halt, and Morrison emerged with the quick stride of a man eager to grasp at any chance for redemption. His pale eyes widened as he saw the bound women in the wagon bed, and for a moment his mask of professional competence slipped to reveal the savage satisfaction beneath. "Well, well," he said softly, approaching the wagon with the careful steps of a hunter approaching wounded prey. "The granddaughters of Chief Nahil delivered right to my doorstep. Running Wolf, you've exceeded even my highest expectations." The Apache scout climbed down from the driver's seat and saluted with perfect military precision. "Found them raiding a supply wagon 5 miles south of here, sir. They put up quite a fight, but I managed to take them alive as ordered." Morrison circled the wagon, slowly studying his captives, with the clinical interest of a man planning an elaborate revenge. Alenia met his gaze steadily, showing no fear despite the hatred burning in his pale eyes. Soraya seemed almost bored, as if being captured by cavalry was merely an inconvenience she'd dealt with many times before. "No sign of the white man who was helping them, Carter." "No, sir. These two were operating alone when I found them. Maybe Carter decided they were too dangerous to associate with." The lie came smoothly from Running Wolf's lips, and Morrison seemed inclined to believe it. The captain's need for a victory was overriding his natural suspicion, just as they had hoped. Colonel Brennan emerged from the office, a distinguished man in his 50s, whose gray beard and lined face spoke of years spent fighting on various frontiers. He studied the prisoners with professional interest, but without the personal hatred that animated Morrison. "So these are the women who've been causing so much trouble," Brennan said mildly. "They don't look like the bloodthirsty savages your reports described, Captain." Morrison's jaw tightened at the implied criticism. "Appearances can be deceiving, sir. These two have killed at least 4 white men, including my son. They're as dangerous as any male warrior." "Indeed. Well, they're your prisoners now, Morrison. What do you propose to do with them?" This was the crucial moment. Morrison needed to suggest taking the women to see Chief Nahil, but the idea had to seem like his own inspiration rather than something he'd been manipulated into. "With your permission, sir, I'd like to interrogate them personally," Morrison said. "But first, I think they should see what happens to Apache leaders who defy the United States government. A visit to their grandfather's cell might convince them to cooperate." Brennan nodded approvingly. "Psychological warfare, I like it. Break their spirits before you break their bodies. Very well, Captain, proceed as you see fit, but I want a full report on whatever intelligence you extract from them." "Of course, sir. Running Wolf, transfer the prisoners to the stockade wagon. We're taking a little trip to the prison compound." As the prisoners were moved from the supply wagon to a reinforced military vehicle designed for transporting dangerous captives, Alenia caught Running Wolf's eye for just a moment. Her slight nod indicated that everything was proceeding according to plan, but the real test would come when they reached the prison itself. The prison compound was a 20-minute ride from the main fort, connected by a well-maintained road that saw regular traffic from guards, administrators, and the occasional official visitor. The facility itself was a monument to military engineering, thick stone walls, topped with iron spikes, guard towers, positioned to provide overlapping fields of fire, and a single heavily defended gate that served as the only entrance. Morrison rode alongside the wagon on his personal horse, his wounded shoulder clearly paining him, but his satisfaction at finally capturing his prey overriding any physical discomfort. He had changed into a fresh uniform for the occasion, wanting to look his best when he gloated over Chief Nahil's defeat. "You know," he said conversationally to the bound women, "your grandfather has been asking about you, wondering what happened to his precious granddaughters. I'm going to enjoy telling him that you died trying to avenge his capture." "We are not dead yet," Soraya replied calmly, testing her bonds with subtle movements that Morrison failed to notice. "A temporary oversight that will be corrected soon enough. But first, I want the old man to see what his legacy has accomplished. I want him to know that his bloodline ends with your execution." The gate guards recognized Morrison and waved the small convoy through without question. Inside the compound, the atmosphere was markedly different from the main fort, quieter, more oppressive, filled with the kind of hopeless resignation that characterized places where men were sent to die slowly. The main prison building was a 3-story structure of gray stone, its windows barred and its corridors echoing with the sounds of despair. Apache prisoners shuffled through the yards in leg irons, their proud bearing broken by months or years of confinement. Some looked up hopefully as the wagon passed, perhaps recognizing the new arrivals as members of their own people. Block 7, Morrison told the prison sergeant, a hard-faced man whose keys jangled with every step. I want these women to see Chief Nahil before we process them for execution. Yes, sir, the old chief's been quiet lately, hasn't eaten much, keeps talking about visions and prophecies. Might be losing his mind. Or planning something, which is why I want him to see his granddaughters in chains. Sometimes the sight of family members in captivity can break even the strongest will. They were escorted through corridors lined with cells, each one containing Apache men who had refused to accept reservation life or who had been accused of various crimes against white settlers. The air was thick with the smell of unwashed bodies and hopelessness, a deliberate tactic designed to break the spirits of proud warriors. Chief Nahil's cell was larger than the others, befitting his status as the most important prisoner in the facility. The old man sat on a narrow cot, his white hair hanging loose around shoulders that had once been broad and powerful, but were now bent with age and confinement. His dark eyes, however, remained bright and alert as Morrison's party approached. "Grandfather," Alenia whispered in Apache, her voice carrying clearly in the stone corridor. The old chief's head snapped up, and for a moment the years seemed to fall away as he recognized the voices of his granddaughters. He rose slowly from the cot, moving with the dignity of a man who refused to let captivity diminish his royal bearing. "My little eagles," he said softly in his native tongue, "you have come home at last." Morrison smiled coldly as he watched the reunion through the cell bars. "Touching, isn't it, the last meeting of the great Nahil family? I hope you're both taking note of your grandfather's accommodations, because you'll be joining him permanently very soon. You think this cage holds my spirit, white soldier?" Nahil's English was accented but clear, learned during years of negotiations with army officials. "You think these walls can contain the wind? I think you're a broken-down old man who's about to watch his granddaughters die for the crimes they've committed. After that, I don't much care whether your spirit is contained or not." The chief studied Morrison with eyes that had seen the rise and fall of nations, the coming of the horse and the gun, the transformation of an entire continent from wilderness to settlement. "You are the one who killed my grandson," he said finally. "The one whose son tried to dishonor my granddaughter." Morrison's face flushed with anger. "Your granddaughters murdered my boy in cold blood. They're going to pay for that crime with their lives. And you will pay for yours. The spirits of the murdered children cry out for justice, and justice will come. Perhaps not today, but it will come." The prison sergeant shifted nervously, unused to having prisoners speak so boldly to officers. "Sir, should I shut him up? We've got ways of keeping the old ones quiet." "Let him talk," Morrison said contemptuously. "Words are all he has left. Soon enough, even those will be silenced forever." But as the captain spoke, he failed to notice that Running Wolf had positioned himself near the cell door's lock mechanism, or that the two supposedly bound prisoners had been working steadily to free themselves during the conversation. The deception was about to reach its explosive conclusion. Meanwhile, 3 miles away at Martinez's trading post, Elias Carter was putting the final touches on his own plan to infiltrate the prison compound. The old Mexican trader had proven surprisingly cooperative once Elias explained the real nature of Morrison's crimes, providing not just civilian clothes and a false identity, but also information about the prison's routines and weaknesses. "The supply deliveries are the key," Martinez explained as he helped Elias transform himself from a recognizable fugitive into an unremarkable civilian contractor. "The guards are used to seeing delivery wagons, repair crews, civilian personnel who service the facility. If you can get the right papers and look like you belong there." "What about weapons? They'll search me at the gate." "Not if you're carrying the right kind of tools. Repair crews bring in all sorts of equipment. crowbars, hammers, even small explosive charges for blasting work. Hide your weapons in a toolkit, and they'll wave you right through. The transformation took the better part of an hour. When it was complete, Elias looked like a middle-aged tradesman down on his luck, the kind of man who took dangerous jobs at military installations because he needed the money. His wooden leg, instead of being a liability, actually helped sell the deception by making him appear harmless and desperate. There's a repair crew scheduled to work on the prison's water system this afternoon, Martinez continued. If you can join them without being noticed, you'll have legitimate access to most of the facility. Just remember, if they catch you, I don't know anything about this conversation. Elias nodded and gathered his disguised weapons hidden among the tools and supplies of an itinerant repairman. The plan was risky, but it was the best chance he had of getting inside the compound before Morrison decided to execute his prisoners. The repair crew proved to be a collection of Mexican laborers supervised by an Anglo foreman who was more interested in his bottle than in the men working under him. Elias simply joined the group as they prepared to enter the prison compound, and no one questioned his presence or his right to be there. Getting through the gate was surprisingly easy. The guards were focused on keeping prisoners in, not on screening every civilian worker who entered. Elias's papers, provided by Martinez, identified him as a plumbing specialist, called in to repair chronic problems with the facility's water supply. Once inside, he was amazed by the size and complexity of the prison compound. It was less a single building than a small city, with workshops, kitchens, administrative offices, and multiple cell blocks all connected by a maze of corridors and courtyards. Finding Chief Nahil's specific location would be like searching for a needle in a haystack. That's when he heard the first gunshot. The sound echoed through the stone corridors like thunder, followed immediately by shouts of alarm and the clatter of running feet. Guards rushed past Elias without giving him a second glance, their attention focused on whatever crisis was developing in the high-security section of the prison. 2 more shots followed in quick succession. The signal Alenia had promised to indicate that they had freed Chief Nahil and were beginning their escape attempt. But the sounds of battle that followed suggested the breakout wasn't going according to plan. Elias abandoned all pretense of being a civilian contractor and ran toward the sounds of gunfire, his concealed weapons now openly displayed as he prepared to fight his way to his companions. Behind him, the prison compound erupted into chaos as guards tried to determine whether they were facing an escape attempt, an outside attack, or both. In Block 7, the deception had finally reached its inevitable conclusion. Soraya had struck first, her freed hands producing a knife that found the prison sergeant's throat before he could draw his sidearm. Running Wolf's rifle spoke next, cutting down the 2 guards who had accompanied Morrison's party into the high-security section. But Morrison himself had proven faster and more resourceful than they'd anticipated. The captain's service revolver was in his hand almost before Soraya's knife had finished its deadly work, and he'd managed to get behind cover before Running Wolf could bring him down. "Clever," Morrison called out from behind an overturned desk, his voice echoing off the stone walls. "Very clever indeed. But you've made one fatal mistake. You're trapped in here with me, and reinforcements are already on their way." Alenia was working frantically to open her grandfather's cell, with keys taken from the dead sergeant, while Soraya and Running Wolf held defensive positions at either end of the corridor. Chief Nahil, despite his age and weakness, was moving with surprising speed to gather what few possessions he wanted to take from his long captivity. "How long before the guards seal off this section?" Alenia asked as the cell door finally swung open. "Minutes at most," Running Wolf replied, firing a shot that kept Morrison pinned behind his improvised barricade. "They'll secure the exits first, then work their way in. We need to move now." Chief Nahil emerged from his cell with the dignity of a king, leaving his palace showing no sign of the fear or confusion that might have been expected from an elderly man suddenly thrust into violent action. "There is another way," he said calmly in Apache. a passage I discovered during my time here, hidden behind the false wall in the adjoining cell. Morrison had apparently learned enough Apache during his years in the territory to understand at least part of what the old chief was saying. Secret passages. He laughed harshly. You think this is some kind of adventure story? This is a modern military prison, old man. Every inch has been mapped and surveyed. Has it? Nahil's voice carried the quiet confidence of a man who had spent 3 years studying his prison with the patience of a hunter observing his prey. Then explain how I knew you were coming today. Explain how I knew my granddaughters would arrive disguised as captives. Morrison's return fire stuttered and stopped as the implications of the chief's words sank in. That's impossible. No one knew about this operation except the guards you trusted, the officers you confided in, the civilian contractors who move freely through your secure facility. Nahil continued. You whites always assume that Apache who seem broken and defeated have stopped thinking, stopped planning. It is a weakness that has served us well over the years. The sound of approaching boots echoed through the corridors as prison guards rushed toward the disturbance. Time was running out fast, and Morrison seemed to realize that his best chance was to eliminate the escapees before reinforcements arrived to complicate the situation. The captain broke from cover with the desperate courage of a man who had nothing left to lose, his revolver spitting fire as he charged toward the group around Chief Nahil's cell. Running Wolf's rifle cracked in response, but Morrison's erratic movement made him a difficult target in the confines of the stone corridor. That's when Elias arrived. The sound of his wooden leg echoing through the prison corridors announced his approach like the drumbeat of approaching doom. Morrison spun toward the new threat just as Elias rounded the corner, both men recognizing each other in the same instant. Carter. Morrison's voice was raw with fury and desperation. I should have known you'd find a way inside. Should have killed me when you had the chance, Elias replied calmly, his twin Colts appearing in his hands with practiced ease. The gunfight that followed would be remembered in Apache oral tradition for generations to come. 2 white men, each representing a different vision of what the frontier could become, facing each other in a prison corridor while the fate of nations hung in the balance between them. Morrison fired first, his military training giving him a slight edge in speed, but Elias had learned his gunfighting in a harder school, where hesitation meant death and mercy was a luxury that few could afford. His return shots came so quickly they seemed like a single extended thunderclap, and Morrison staggered backward as the bullets found their mark. The captain tried to raise his revolver for one final shot, but his strength was failing as blood poured from wounds in his chest and shoulder. He fell slowly like a tree cut down by an expert woodsman, his pale eyes fixed on Elias with a hatred that would follow him into whatever judgment awaited beyond death. You've doomed them all, Morrison whispered as his life ebbed away. Without me, to protect them, Holloway and his allies will burn every Apache camp from here to Mexico. Elias stood over the dying man, feeling no satisfaction in the victory he'd won. Maybe, but at least they'll face their enemies with the truth on their side. Morrison's final words were lost in the growing sounds of battle as prison guards finally reached Block 7 and began their assault on the escape party. But by then, Chief Nahil had led his rescuers to the hidden passage he'd discovered during years of patient observation, and they were already disappearing into the secret ways that honeycombed the mountain beneath the prison. The old chief moved through the narrow tunnels with the confidence of a man following a well-known path, despite his age and the years of confinement that should have broken his spirit. Behind him, his granddaughters and their allies followed in single file, marveling at the network of passages that their grandfather had somehow mapped during his captivity. How did you know? Alenia asked as they paused to rest in a wider section of the tunnel system. How did you know we were coming today? Chief Nahil smiled, and for a moment, the years fell away to reveal the war leader he had once been. Because I have been preparing for this day since the moment they locked me in that cage. Every guard's routine, every weakness in their security, every possible route of escape, I have studied it all with the patience of a hunter, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. But the passage, the hidden entrance to your cell, carved it myself, one grain of sand at a time over 3 years of nights, when the guards thought I was sleeping. The stones in these mountains are soft if you know where to apply pressure, and I learned much about stone cutting from the Mexican masons who built the original prison. Running Wolf shook his head in amazement. 3 years of planning, 3 years of waiting for the right moment. 3 years of keeping my people's hope alive, the old chief corrected gently. A leader's greatest responsibility is never to let his followers believe that defeat is permanent. As long as one voice continues to speak of freedom, the spirit of resistance can never truly die. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit were growing fainter as the prison guards struggled to locate the entrance to the passage system. But Elias knew it was only a matter of time before they brought in bloodhounds or Apache trackers who could follow their scent through the tunnels. "Where does this lead?" he asked as they resumed their journey through the mountain's heart. "To a place where my people have gathered in times of great danger for longer than the white man has walked this continent," Nahil replied. "A sacred valley where the spirits of our ancestors still ride and where no enemy has ever set foot." The journey through the tunnels took most of the night, but finally they emerged into a hidden valley that seemed to exist outside of time itself. Ancient cliff dwellings dotted the canyon walls, their empty windows looking down like the eyes of long-dead gods. A clear stream ran through the valley floor, and grass grew green despite the drought that had withered the surrounding country. "The Valley of Spirits," Alenia whispered, her voice filled with awe. "I thought it was only legend." "All legends have their basis in truth," her grandfather replied. "This place has been our final refuge for 800 years, known only to the chiefs and their chosen successors. Here we can rest and plan our next move." As dawn broke over the hidden valley, painting the ancient cliff dwellings in shades of gold and red, the 5 survivors of the night's adventures finally allowed themselves to hope that their desperate gamble might actually succeed. They had the evidence needed to expose Morrison's corruption, they had freed the most important Apache leader in captivity, and they had struck a blow against the forces that had oppressed the native peoples for so long. But they also knew that their victory was only the beginning of a longer struggle. Senator Holloway and his allies would not simply accept the exposure of their crimes, they would fight back with every weapon at their disposal, and the blood price for justice would be higher than any of them could imagine. In the distance, smoke rose from the direction of Fort Bowie, as the military authorities struggled to contain the scandal of Chief Nahil's escape. Soon, every soldier in Arizona Territory would be hunting for the fugitives, and the final confrontation between truth and corruption would begin in earnest. The ancient springs of the Valley of Spirits provided more than just water. They offered the first true rest any of them had known in weeks. Chief Nahil, despite his age and the ordeal of imprisonment, seemed to grow stronger with each hour spent in this sacred place, as if the very air here carried healing properties known only to his people. "We cannot stay long," he said, as they gathered around a small fire hidden deep within one of the cliff dwellings. "By now, Colonel Brennan will have sent word to every military post in the territory. They will bring in Apache scouts, bloodhounds, perhaps even the Buffalo Soldiers from Fort Davis. This valley may be hidden, but it is not invisible to a determined search." Elias was cleaning Morrison's blood from his guns, the methodical routine helping him process what he'd done in that prison corridor. "What about the evidence? Morrison's dead, but Holloway and his network are still out there. Without the captain to protect them, they might try to destroy whatever records we haven't already captured." Soraya had been examining the documents they'd taken from Morrison's hidden supply caches, her scarred fingers tracing over signatures and official seals that could topple governments. "There is enough here to hang a dozen men," she said quietly. "Bills of sale for Apache children correspondence about splitting profits from stolen supplies, even orders to eliminate witnesses who might expose the operation. But getting this information to honest authorities, that's the challenge," Running Wolf added. "Every territorial official could be compromised, every newspaper editor bought or intimidated. How do we know who to trust?" Chief Nahil smiled with the patient wisdom of a man who had outlived empires. "There is one man in Tucson who cannot be bought or threatened into silence. A man whose newspaper has always spoken the truth, no matter how dangerous that truth might be." "Javier Morales," Alenia said with sudden understanding. "Editor of La Voz Libre. His family was massacred by irregular troops 3 years ago, men who were supposed to be protecting Mexican settlers from Apache raids, but were actually working for American land speculators. The same land speculators who employed Morrison's services," her grandfather confirmed. "Morales has been investigating the connections between corrupt officials and business interests for years. He simply lacked the evidence to prove his theories." Elias thought about the implications of what they were proposing. Tucson was 60 miles away through country that would soon be crawling with cavalry patrols. Getting there alive would require more than just luck. It would take a miracle. "Even if we reach Morales safely," he said, "what's to stop Holloway from having him killed before he can publish anything dead journalists tell no tales? Which is why we must do more than simply hand over the documents," Nahil replied. "We must ensure that multiple copies reach multiple destinations simultaneously. Newspapers in Denver and San Francisco, officials in Washington who are not part of Holloway's network, perhaps even contacts in Mexico City who would be interested in evidence of American crimes against their citizens." The plan was ambitious to the point of seeming impossible, but as they discussed the details, it began to take shape. Running Wolf would carry copies of the most damning documents to his contacts among the reservation Apache men who could get word to sympathetic missionaries and Indian agents in other territories. Soraya would take another set to Mexican authorities in Hermosillo, crossing the border through smuggler routes she'd learned during her years of captivity. "And the rest of us?" Alenia asked. "We go to Tucson," her grandfather said simply, "but not as fugitives running for our lives. We go as Apache leaders seeking justice through the white man's own legal system. We demand a hearing before the territorial governor, insist on our right to present evidence of crimes committed against our people." "That's suicide," Elias protested. "The moment you show yourself in public, every bounty hunter and cavalry trooper in Arizona will be gunning for you." Chief Nahil's dark eyes glittered with something that might have been amusement. "Perhaps, but sometimes the most dangerous course is also the safest. They expect us to run to hide, to act like the guilty fugitives their propaganda has portrayed us as. They will not expect us to walk boldly into the territorial capital and demand justice under their own laws." It was a strategy born of desperation and wisdom, in equal measure the kind of audacious gamble that either ended in complete triumph or spectacular destruction. But as Elias considered the alternatives, he realized it might be their only real chance of success. The next morning they began preparing for what they all knew might be their final journey together. Running Wolf would leave first, using his knowledge of Apache trails to reach the reservation and begin spreading word of Morrison's crimes among the scattered bands. Soraya would follow a different route, guided by her memories of the smuggler paths she'd learned during her escape from Mexican slavery. "Take this," Chief Nahil said to Running Wolf, removing a silver medallion from around his neck. "It bears the mark of our family, the symbol that identifies you as my chosen messenger. Any Apache who sees it that will know you speak with my voice." The scout accepted the medallion with the reverence due a sacred trust. If I do not see you again in this life, grandfather, know that your words will be remembered. Your granddaughter's courage will become legend among our people." Soraya's farewell was more practical but no less emotional. She embraced her sister and grandfather with fierce intensity, knowing this separation might be permanent. "If the authorities try to capture you in Tucson," she warned, "do not expect mercy. They will want to make examples of you, and public executions draw large crowds. Then we must ensure the truth is published before they have a chance to silence us," Alenia replied. "The court of public opinion can be more powerful than any legal tribunal." As Running Wolf and Soraya departed on their separate missions, Elias found himself alone with the two most wanted Apache in Arizona territory, preparing for a journey that would take them directly into the heart of enemy territory. The irony wasn't lost on him. 6 months ago, he would have cheerfully turned them over to Morrison for the bounty money. Now he was risking his life to help them achieve justice for crimes committed against their people. "You know," he said as they prepared to leave the valley, "there's still time for you to change your minds. Find another way, one that doesn't involve walking into what's almost certainly a trap." Chief Nahil shouldered his pack with movements that belied his advanced age. "My friend, I have been walking into traps for 73 years. Sometimes the only way to escape is to spring the trap yourself on your own terms." The journey to Tucson took 3 days through country that seemed designed by nature to break the spirits of travelers. The drought had turned the landscape into a moonscape of cracked earth and dead vegetation, broken only by the occasional green spot that marked a hidden spring or underground stream. They traveled mostly at night to avoid cavalry patrols, hiding during the day in caves and arroyos that provided shelter from both the sun and searching eyes. On the second night, they encountered their first serious obstacle, a cavalry checkpoint blocking the main road to Tucson. From their hiding place among the rocks, they could see soldiers stopping and searching every wagon, every rider, every person who tried to pass. The net was tightening around them with military precision. "How many men?" Nahil whispered as Elias studied the checkpoint through his field glasses. 20, maybe 25. Too many to fight, and their position to cover all the obvious routes around them. "Then we don't use the obvious routes," Alenia said quietly. "There is another way through the saguaro forest where the great cacti grow so thick that horses cannot pass between them. We would have to go on foot, and it would add a full day to our journey." Elias thought of his wooden leg already aching from the miles they'd covered and tried not to show his concern. "Lead the way. I've come this far. I'm not stopping now." The saguaro forest proved to be a cathedral of living pillars, some reaching 40 feet into the star-filled sky. The ancient cacti stood like silent sentinels, their arms raised in what seemed like permanent supplication to gods that had watched this land long before the first humans arrived. Moving through the forest required careful navigation, as the spaces between the giants were often too narrow for passage, forcing them to backtrack and find new routes again and again. "My people believe these cacti are the spirits of ancient warriors," Nahil said during a brief rest in a clearing where moonlight filtered down through the canopy of arms and spines. "They guard the sacred places, protect the water sources, and provide sanctuary for those who travel with pure hearts." "And those who don't?" Elias asked, noting how the thorns seemed to reach out toward any unwary traveler. "The desert has many ways of claiming the unworthy," the old chief replied cryptically. By dawn of the third day, they could see Tucson in the distance, a sprawling collection of adobe buildings and wooden structures that had grown from a small Spanish mission into a bustling territorial capital. Smoke rose from countless chimneys, and the sounds of commerce and civilization drifted across the desert on the morning breeze. But the city was also clearly under military occupation. Cavalry patrols moved through the streets with obvious purpose, and roadblocks controlled every major approach. Wanted posters bearing their likenesses were posted on every corner, offering rewards that would make even honest citizens consider turning them in. Their Alenia pointed to a modest building near the center of town, distinguishable by the printing press visible through its front windows. La Voz Libre, Morales's newspaper. Getting there is going to be the challenge, Elias muttered, studying the patrols and checkpoints that surrounded their destination. The whole town's locked down tighter than a military camp. Nahil was examining the city with the tactical eye of a war leader who had spent decades planning raids and ambushes. The soldiers are looking for fugitives trying to sneak into town, he observed. They will not expect us to arrive as legitimate visitors with business to conduct. What do you mean? I mean we walk through the front door openly and without concealment. I am Chief Nahil of the Chiricahua Apache, here to meet with territorial authorities about grave injustices committed against my people. My granddaughter and my white associate are here to ensure my safety and provide translation services. Elias stared at the old man as if he'd taken leave of his senses. They'll arrest us the moment we set foot in town. Perhaps, but they will also be confused, uncertain about how to proceed. And in that confusion, we might find the opportunity we need to reach Morales and present our evidence. It was another desperate gamble, but like so many of their recent decisions, it had the virtue of being completely unexpected. Instead of trying to sneak into Tucson like criminals, they would arrive like dignitaries seeking official redress for wrongs committed against them. The transformation took an hour of careful preparation. Using supplies they'd saved from their journey, they made themselves as presentable as possible. Nahil's white hair was braided with eagle feathers and silver ornaments that marked his status as a chief. Alenia wore her finest deerskin dress, the one decorated with intricate beadwork that proclaimed her royal bloodline. Even Elias cleaned himself up as much as possible, trying to look like a respectable civilian rather than a fugitive from justice. Remember, Nahil said as they prepared to enter the city, we are not criminals seeking to avoid justice. We are injured parties seeking to present evidence of crimes committed against us. Hold your heads high, speak with dignity, and let them wonder why we are not acting like the guilty fugitives they expect. The first checkpoint they encountered was manned by nervous young soldiers who had clearly been briefed to watch for Apache fugitives, but hadn't been told what to do if those fugitives walked up and introduced themselves politely. The sergeant in charge found himself in the awkward position of having to arrest people who were clearly the ones he was looking for, but who were presenting themselves in a manner that made such action seem inappropriate. I am Chief Nahil, the old man said with quiet dignity, showing no fear despite being surrounded by armed soldiers. I seek an audience with Governor Williams to present evidence of corruption and crimes committed against my people by federal officials. The sergeant stammered clearly out of his depth. You're under arrest, all of you, for murder and for seeking justice through legal channels. Nahil's voice carried the calm authority of a man accustomed to command. For presenting evidence of corruption to the proper authorities, I was not aware these were crimes under American law. You killed Captain Morrison. Captain Morrison was killed while attempting to prevent the exposure of his criminal activities, Elias said, stepping forward with papers in his hand. These documents prove systematic theft of government supplies meant for Apache families, the sale of Apache children to Mexican slavers, and correspondence with Senator Holloway regarding the division of profits from these illegal activities. The sergeant found himself holding papers that appeared to be official government documents signed and sealed, detailing crimes that made him sick to read. His authority to arrest obvious fugitives suddenly seemed less clear-cut when those fugitives were presenting evidence of massive corruption by his own superiors. I need to contact my commanding officer, he said finally. You'll have to wait here while I get instructions. It was exactly the confusion they'd hoped to create. Instead of being immediately arrested and thrown into jail, they found themselves under a kind of protective custody, while military authorities tried to figure out how to handle the situation. Word of their arrival spread through Tucson like wildfire, and within an hour crowds had gathered to see the legendary Apache chief who had dared to walk into the territorial capital demanding justice. That's when Javier Morales arrived. The editor of La Voz Libre was a small, intense man in his 40s with the ink-stained fingers and sharp eyes of someone who had spent his life pursuing truth through the printed word. He pushed through the crowd of soldiers and civilians with the confidence of a man who knew his rights and wasn't afraid to exercise them. "I am Javier Morales," he announced to the confused sergeant, "editor and publisher of La Voz Libre. I understand Chief Nahil has evidence of government corruption that he wishes to present to the proper authorities. As a member of the press, I have the right to interview him and examine any documents he chooses to share." "Sir, these people are wanted fugitives, accused fugitives," Morales corrected sharply, "and they are presenting themselves voluntarily to discuss evidence of crimes committed against them. Until they are formally charged and convicted in a court of law, they retain their rights as residents of this territory." The legal technicalities were probably questionable, but Morales spoke with such authority that the young sergeant found himself nodding along. More importantly, the crowd was growing larger and more interested in what was happening. Arresting people who were trying to expose corruption would look bad in the newspapers, especially when those newspapers were controlled by editors who had no love for the territorial government. 10 minutes, the sergeant said finally. "You can interview them for 10 minutes while I wait for orders from my superiors." Morales's dark eyes lit up as he realized what he was being offered. "Senor Chief Senorita, would you care to step into my office where we can discuss these matters more privately?" The office of La Voz Libre was cramped and cluttered, filled with the organized chaos of a working newspaper, but it also represented something precious in this frontier territory, an independent voice, a place where truth could be spoken without fear of immediate retribution. "Show me," Morales said simply once they were behind closed doors. Nahil and Alenia spread the documents across the editor's desk like generals laying out battle plans. Morrison's correspondence, the supply invoices, the bills of sale for Apache children, the communications with Senator Holloway, all of it laid bare for examination by someone who understood both the legal implications and the human cost of such corruption. Morales's face grew darker with each document he examined. "Mother of God," he whispered, "this is worse than I suspected. Morrison wasn't just stealing supplies, he was operating a slave market using Apache children as merchandise. And Senator Holloway was taking a percentage of the profits," Elias added. "The man who built his political career as a champion of Indian pacification was actually profiting from their suffering." "How many copies of these documents exist?" "Our allies are carrying additional copies to other destinations," Alenia replied. "But you are our best hope of reaching the public before powerful men can silence us." And Morales was already moving, gathering paper and ink, shouting for his assistants to prepare for an emergency printing run. "This will be the lead story in tomorrow's edition. But more than that, I have contacts in Denver, San Francisco, even Mexico City. By the end of the week, every newspaper in the Southwest will be carrying this story." "You understand the risk you're taking?" Nahil asked quietly. "Holloway and his allies will not simply accept the exposure of their crimes. They will fight back, and they will not be particular about the methods they use." The editor's smile was grim but determined. "Let them come. The truth is, like water, try to dam it up, and it will find another way to flow. Try to silence one voice, and 10 others will rise to take its place." Outside, they could hear the sound of approaching cavalry, not the small patrol that had been guarding them, but a full troop moving at high speed through the streets of Tucson. Their time was running out rapidly. "There is a back exit," Morales said, reading the situation correctly. "It leads to an alley that connects with the old mission. You could reach the Mexican quarter of town before the soldiers surround this building." "What about you?" Alenia asked. "They'll know you have the documents." "Let them know. By tomorrow morning the story will be in print and on its way to every major city in the region. After that, killing me would only confirm the truth of what I've published." Nahil clasped the editor's hand with both of his own. "You honor us with your courage, my friend. History will remember what you do today." "History will remember what you've all done," Morales replied. 3 years ago, if someone had told me I would risk my life to help Apache fugitives expose government corruption, I would have laughed at them. But truth makes strange allies of us all. The sound of soldiers surrounding the building was growing louder, accompanied by shouted orders and the clatter of weapons being readied for action. Through the front windows they could see blue uniforms taking positions to prevent any escape from the newspaper office. "Now would be a good time to leave," Elias observed, checking his guns one final time. They slipped out through the rear entrance as the first soldiers kicked in the front door, emerging into an alley that smelled of cooking food and unwashed humanity. The Mexican quarter of Tucson was a maze of narrow streets and adobe buildings where 3 Apache could disappear if they knew how to move like shadows. Behind them, they could hear the sounds of confrontation as soldiers demanded to know where the fugitives had gone and what documents they had shared with Morales. The editor's voice rose above the others, calmly explaining that he was a journalist, exercising his right to interview newsworthy subjects, and that any interference with his newspaper would be reported to authorities in Washington. "Will he be safe?" Alenia asked, as they made their way through increasingly narrow alleys toward the old Spanish mission that still served as a sanctuary for anyone seeking shelter. "Safer than we are," her grandfather replied. "Killing a prominent editor would create more problems than it solves. They will probably arrest him, search his office, try to confiscate the documents, but the story is already written and his assistants know how to operate the printing press." The mission of San Agustin was exactly what they needed, a place where the old Spanish traditions of sanctuary still held some force, where priests who remembered older laws of hospitality might provide shelter for those seeking justice. Father Miguel, the ancient pastor who greeted them at the door, took one look at Chief Nahil and made the sign of the cross. "I know who you are," he said quietly in Spanish, "and I know why you have come. Enter, and may God protect you." The sanctuary of the mission was cool and dim, filled with the scent of candles and centuries of prayer. Here, at least, they could rest for a few hours while Morales worked to get their story into print, and the military authorities tried to figure out how to handle the political explosion they'd just created. "What happens now?" Elias asked as they settled into the shadows of the ancient building. Chief Nahil smiled with the satisfaction of a man who had finally struck a decisive blow against his enemies. "Now we wait. Holloway and his allies will try to discredit the documents, claim they are forgeries created by savage terrorists. But Morales is thorough. He will verify signatures, check dates against official records, interview witnesses who can confirm the truth of what we've revealed. And if they try to suppress the story, then it becomes a story about government suppression of the press, which is even more dangerous to them than the original corruption charges. Sometimes the cover-up is worse than the crime." As night fell over Tucson, the first copies of La Voz Libre's emergency edition began appearing on the streets. The headlines were stark and uncompromising. "Corruption exposed Senator Holloway linked to Apache child slave trade." Below that, in smaller but equally damaging text, "Government officials profit from stolen supplies meant for starving families." The reaction was immediate and explosive. Crowds gathered outside the newspaper office, some demanding more information, others calling for the arrest of everyone involved in exposing what they preferred to believe were lies. Military authorities tried to confiscate copies of the paper, but new editions kept appearing as fast as they could be suppressed. By morning, telegraph wires were carrying the story to every major city in America. Newspapers in Denver and San Francisco picked up the reports and began their own investigations. Even papers back east, normally unconcerned with frontier affairs, found the story of Apache children being sold into slavery too shocking to ignore. "It's working," Father Miguel reported as he brought them news from the outside world. "The territorial governor has called for a full investigation. Representatives from Washington are already on their way to examine the evidence. Senator Holloway's office has issued a statement denying all charges, but 3 other senators have called for an immediate hearing." Chief Nahil received this news with the calm satisfaction of a warrior who had finally struck the blow he'd been planning for years. "Good. Truth is like a seed once planted. It grows beyond anyone's ability to control." "What about us?" Alenia asked. "We're still wanted fugitives. Investigation or no investigation, they'll still try to arrest us for Morrison's death." "Perhaps," her grandfather replied, "but now we are also witnesses in a federal investigation. Killing witnesses tends to make authorities suspicious, and Holloway can't afford any more suspicion right now." 3 days later, their legal status was clarified by the arrival of federal marshals from Washington, men who answered to authorities higher than territorial officials and who had been sent specifically to investigate the corruption allegations. Chief Nahil, Alenia, and Elias found themselves under federal protection rather than territorial arrest, their safety guaranteed until the investigation could be completed. The hearings that followed were a sensation throughout the Southwest. Day after day, witnesses testified about stolen supplies, missing children, and payments made to corrupt officials. Morrison's correspondence was authenticated by handwriting experts, and shipping records confirmed the systematic theft of government resources. Senator Holloway tried to distance himself from the scandal, claiming he had been deceived by subordinates and had no knowledge of the illegal activities. But when Running Wolf and Soraya returned from their separate missions, with additional evidence and witnesses, the web of corruption proved too extensive to dismiss as the work of a few rogue officials. The final blow came when Colonel Brennan Morrison's own commanding officer testified that he had repeatedly warned his superiors about the captain's suspicious activities but had been ordered to remain silent. "I was told that Captain Morrison enjoyed protection from the highest levels," Brennan said under oath. "I was told that questioning his methods would be considered an act of insubordination." 2 weeks after their dramatic arrival in Tucson, Chief Nahil stood before a federal tribunal as a witness rather than a defendant. His testimony, delivered with the dignity and precision of a man who had waited years for this moment, detailed decades of broken promises, stolen resources, and systematic oppression. "You ask me why my people resist your civilization," he said in his closing statement. "I tell you it is not your civilization we resist, but your betrayal of that civilization's own principles. You speak of law and justice, but you practice theft and murder. You promise protection and deliver slavery. We ask only for the same justice under law that you claim for yourselves." The tribunal's verdict was swift and decisive. Senator Holloway was expelled from Congress and faced federal charges for his role in the corruption scheme. Dozens of territorial officials were removed from office, and new policies were implemented to prevent the theft of resources meant for Apache families. But perhaps most importantly, Chief Nahil and his granddaughters were not only cleared of all charges, but were officially recognized as instrumental in exposing government corruption. They were free to return to their people as heroes rather than fugitives. The day they left Tucson, half the town turned out to see them off. Javier Morales presented Chief Nahil with the first copy of his book about the corruption scandal, already being published in English and Spanish for distribution throughout the Americas. "You have given me the story of a lifetime," the editor said. "But more than that, you have reminded me why I became a journalist in the first place, to speak truth to power, no matter how dangerous that truth might be." Elias Carter found himself at a crossroads as the others prepared to return to Apache lands. His ranch was a ruin, his old life destroyed beyond repair, but he had found something in the sacred valleys and hidden passages of the Apache, a sense of purpose that had been missing since the deaths of his wife and son. "Come with us," Alenia said as they prepared to part ways. "There is a place among our people for a man who fights for justice rather than revenge." Elias looked back at Tucson, then toward the mountains where ancient peoples had made their homes for centuries beyond counting. "I think I might like that," he said finally. "I've spent enough years living with hate. Maybe it's time to try living with hope instead." Chief Nahil smiled as he watched the unlikely alliance that had formed between his granddaughters and the scarred white rancher who had risked everything to help them achieve justice. "The spirits work in mysterious ways," he observed. "Sometimes the greatest enemies become the strongest allies, and the most bitter defeats become the most decisive victories." As they rode toward the mountains where Running Wolf and Soraya waited with news of how the Apache bands had received word of their triumph, Chief Nahil reflected on the strange turn his life had taken. 3 years ago he had been captured and imprisoned, his people scattered and demoralized. Today he rode free through country. His ancestors had roamed for countless generations, carrying proof that justice was still possible even in the darkest of times. The old ways were dying, and perhaps that was inevitable. But the new ways that would replace them didn't have to be built on lies and cruelty. Truth had won a victory here, and hope had been kindled among people who had almost forgotten what hope felt like. In the years that followed the story of Chief Nahil's rescue and the exposure of the corruption scandal would become legend among the Apache. Children would grow up hearing about the granddaughters who had risked everything to free their grandfather and the white man who had chosen justice over revenge. But for now, it was enough to ride through the desert under an endless sky, knowing that sometimes truth really did triumph over power, and that justice delayed was not always justice denied. The wind carried the sound of their horses' hooves across ancient lands, and the mountains seemed to welcome them home.